and welcome to a brand new life, to a brand new day, all the way from the wastelands of California. My name is Michael, and I am a sinner. I look forward to once again serve you those sounds of salvation. First-time listeners, turn on, tune in, and drop out. This is a very different kind of show, a place where we don't feel so alone. Let us chase away the light no matter what you at home choose to believe. I do admire you for your curiosity, live and direct, and hopefully all goes well. My first guest this evening is James Perloff. James is the author of The Shadows of Power, an expose of the Council on Foreign Relations that has sold over 100,000 copies, and the evidence against Darwin's theory of evolution. He wrote for the New American magazine for nearly 3 decades. He recently released his new book, 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw. And of course, after the break, we will be joined by Dr. Frank Albo. Hello, boys and girls. Welcome back to the program. Thanks for sticking around. We did have some technical difficulties, but all seems to be going well. I hope all of you are doing fantastic tonight. Let's bring in James. And James, how's it going out there, James? How are you?
I'm good. How about the live stream?
We're good. The live stream is back and in full effect. Everything sounds fine. And of course, welcome back to the program, James.
Oh, thanks. I hope we still have some listeners out there.
We do.
Again, if we're archived, they kind of, any people we lost can pick it up afterwards if they choose to.
Yeah, no doubt. Everything's fine now. James, how are you this evening? Is everything going well out there in your part of the land?
Well, I don't like the shape that the world's in right now, but I'm, okay sitting here right now talking to you.
Perfect. And of course, like I said earlier during the program about autism, we were talking a little bit about that, and I had asked you if you were basically on board with any of those notions, and of course, you told me that you were fully on board.
Oh, 100% sure. No question about it. They're making babies take hepatitis B vaccine on the day of birth, which you can't get hepatitis B as an infant. You'd have to you get stuck with a dirty needle or have sex with a prostitute who was infected. Just a big pharma, of course, when they make these vaccines mandatory, and the hepatitis B is 3 doses. And you have mandatory for millions of babies. And just think of the profits for Big Pharma, which cannot be sued, as you probably know. They can't be sued for any vaccine injuries. You have to go to vaccine court, prove that your child was injured by the vaccine, and then you get paid by the American taxpayer, not by the pharmaceutical companies. It's what a game.
No doubt. And by the way, James, are you affiliated with any groups or political parties?
Well, no, independent, certainly I identify with the entire truth movement. I was a member of the John Birch Society for a number of years and wrote for their flagship journal, The New American, for on and off for 27 years. But I'm basically just an independent blogger at this point, but I do speaking engagements, podcasts, Twitter, etc.
No problem. I'm not affiliated with any political party or group myself. I actually was at one time a registered Green Party member, but of course I had to remove myself after I learned a little bit about the corruption of good old Ralph Nader out there.
I don't know too much about his corruption personally, but I do know that the big foundations have poured hundreds of millions of dollars into the green movement, which is basically a pretext for control. You've got too big of a carbon footprint and they can regulate your energy use. It's a pretext for controlling the population. The fat cats like Al Gore, they can use all the energy they want in their homes. Al Gore even had I don't know if he still does, but he had a heated swimming pool in his house. Imagine the energy that uses, but it's our energy. The average guy is the one who restricted that. And that's part of the whole Orwellian police state. It's just, the environmental big brother.
No doubt. And what about mom and dad? What were they like? Were they religious, James?
No, no. I grew up in an agnostic home. My father was Jewish, although I didn't know that until I was over 20. And but he wanted nothing to do with religion at all, Jewish or otherwise. And my mother was a son of a Freemason. She grew up a nominally Christian, but we were not a church-going family. We had no, God was not part of our home.
Understood. And another very interesting fact about you, one of, well, not exactly your earliest books, but you did write a book called The Case Against Darwin. I was curious to ask if you still withhold your beliefs from that book today, James.
Do I still hold them? Absolutely. I wrote a book prior to that in 1999. The one you mentioned came out in 2002, called Tornado in a Junkyard, which is an extensive debunking of Darwin's theory of evolution. The second book, The Case Against Darwin, there were people who contacted me asking for multiple copies of Tornado in a Junkyard. They give it to legislators or school board members, and I said, those kind of people don't have time for a big 300-page book. So The Case Against Darwin is a very short book that you can read in an hour. But this was important to me, having grown up agnostic, becoming a Christian in the early 80s. I still had these held over ideas, I still had these memories of reading in National Geographic how Louis Leakey had discovered that we came from the Australopithecines, these ape men. And I said, I want to know the truth scientifically about man's origins. Is the Bible right? Because the Bible is quite different than what Darwin was saying about, hundreds of millions of years. We all started out as single-celled bacterium in the ocean, evolved into, invertebrates, and then into fish, and then the fish came on shore, and over eons evolved into apes or ape-like creatures who evolved into men. And I wanted to know scientifically what the facts were. When I studied it, I was shocked to find, because I'd grown up in Matrix like everybody else, how much overwhelming scientific evidence there is against Darwin's theory. And the reason I wrote those two books was because most of the books were written by scientists who were not journalists, and they made tremendous arguments, but sometimes the books were a little over the layman's head, and I wanted to write something that was very user-friendly, very easy to read. I see.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. And of course, personally speaking, I've partially leaned towards I guess you could say, the scientific community's evidence that life came from space, a concept that we all know now as panspermia. Do you believe that's not exactly correct, James?
No, I take the Christian's perspective that life was created by God. I know that Richard Dawkins and others have advanced that idea. But, if you, we could get into the evidence against Darwinism, but if you believe we're seeded by aliens, then you still have to explain how the alien life evolved. Right. At some point, it must have started, and that's usually problematic because the same problems would exist for life beginning in another galaxy as it would on planet Earth.
And James, I do admit that I am an agnostic atheist. Which means I'm at constant battle from within. Some would refer that as a spiritual battle. Perhaps it really just depends on my mood, to be quite honest. I think I'll keep Jesus in my back pocket.
Well, that's a good idea. At least have that openness.
Sure.
To that. Like I say, I grew up agnostic. Then I was actually in a New Age cult, non-Christian cult for a number of years, from 72 to 82, before coming to Christ. And then, I became an Orthodox Christian 2 years ago, Eastern Orthodox. In other words, I'm neither Protestant nor Catholic. I was never Catholic, but I do believe that we have a distorted view of Christianity here in the West. The church was basically at peace with itself for the first 1,000 years after Christ, and then in 1054 AD, the East-West split occurred, and from that point forward, all we got in the West, Europe, and then the Americas was, the Vatican's viewpoint. And when the Protestants split off, and then they splintered into 1,000 denominations and spin-offs, we got, a very disjointed and very sundry views of what Christianity was. So I don't feel that in the West we ever really got the real picture. But Eastern Orthodoxy still worships as was taught by the apostles, and still worships using the same liturgy, believe it or not, that was used in the 4th century when Constantine first legalized the church. And so one of the things I realized, it's often best to go back to the beginning when you want to of things, when you want to find out the truth about them.
Yep, going back to the roots, no doubt. And of course, speaking of which, by 1969, you were an English major at this point in your life, and you became interested in politics. And during that time, you gravitated towards the hippie movement, as one would call it. And tell me about those times in 1969. It seems like it seems like such a wild time. And I assume you enjoyed those times, correct, James?
Well, to a certain extent, I did. I graduated from high school in '69, and I knew some hippies because there was a place I was volunteering at where there were some hippies, and I wound up getting into a hippie apartment in 1970 in Cambridge, Mass, which is right close to Harvard, and that was kind of one of the centers of the hippie movement. I have to say, honestly, that one thing that drew me into the hippie movement was being pretty dorky in high school, not athletic, and not having a lot of social appeal. One thing I really liked about the hippie movement, at least in its initial phases, was that they were very accepting of people, and it was very easy to get along with them and have adult conversations with them. And I much preferred it to the rather rough lifestyle of high school that I'd experienced. So that was one of the things that drew me into that. And I did have an interest in the anti-war movement, and I was, attended some marches, etc. And again, a lot of that was centered in Cambridge, Mass. But with the end of the Vietnam War, of course, that ended, and what I considered all the good music ended, which I had enjoyed, Simon and Garfunkel, and
I agree,
the Motown bands and all those great bands of the 60s and early 70s, all of a sudden vanished and suddenly got replaced by disco, which I really had no appeal for me.
Yeah, well, disco sucks. That's just a fact.
I stopped listening to pop music at that point, continued my involvement in this cult because I was looking for ways out of some of the personal problems that I had, and then finally realized that the cult had been teaching a lot of lies, and managed to get out of that cult. And at that point, I felt myself being drawn very much to Christ. But one factor in that was actually
James, by the way, this was 1970, correct?
Well, 1970, I was a hippie, and then gradually that movement kind of died out. The anti-war, it actually started to degrade after 1970, but in 1970, which is the year of Kent State and the year of the college strike, that's kind of when it peaked, and things were really hopping in Cambridge, Mass at that time. I did enjoy it. I was 18, but I was hanging out with guys who were, in their early 20s, more mature than I was, and it's nice to, be interacting in a way that I had not experienced in high school. But a thing that really changed my perspective greatly was in 1978, and when I saw a girl reading Gary Allen's book, None Dare Call a Conspiracy. And I didn't speak to the girl, and I didn't look inside the book, but something told me, you have to read that book. I looked at the cover and I said, you've got to get that book. And I found a copy of the book in a local bookstore, read it, and that forever changed my perspective, because that book, for the first time, made history make sense. I mean, it talked about the Federal Reserve, it talked about the Council on Foreign Relations, it talked about the drive for world government, it talked about the shadow government, and suddenly I realized that history had an agenda and a pattern to it. And just to carry the story a little further, the author of that book, Gary Allen, had mentioned that the John Birch Society was very much in the forefront of the fight against this New World Order, which was true in those days. And I went down there, became a member, and I started writing for their magazine, The New American, in 1985, then wrote a book on the Council on Foreign Relations in 1988 called The Shadows of Power, which became a big bestseller for them. And that was kind of the embarking on my literary career. But what I wanted to point out was that the discovery that history had an agenda was a factor in my becoming a Christian, because I realized that there was this good versus evil. And actually, if you look at the New World Order people, I just saw that thing just on Twitter today of Madonna doing her thing at Eurovision in Israel, and her dance or her song was a very much like a satanic ritual. And these guys are into Luciferianism. If you look at Bohemian Grove or the comments made by, I've seen the interview with Ronald Bernard, the Dutch banker,
Right.
who broke away from the oligarchs. They wanted to engage in satanic spiritual sacrifice of children. Well, when you realize that that there's Luciferians that are running this New World Order, you start to get the picture that this is a spiritual battle, and you start to realize that if these guys are Luciferians, then the guys on the other side are on God's side. These guys are liars. They kill people. They cause wars. They cheat people through inflation and central banking, and you start to realize that hey, there is moral righteousness to be found in the Christian worldview. I'm not saying that speaking for all Christians, but the way Jesus taught it, forgiveness and love and righteousness, and telling the truth, the 10 Commandments, not killing people, not lying, not stealing. Right. I realized that I wanted to be on the side of the good guys.
Sure.
But it took me a long time to, it took me 30 years to become a Christian, and much longer than that to kind of get out of the Western mindset of Christianity into Eastern Orthodoxy.
Understood. And we sort of jumped ahead just a little bit here, but that's okay. We'll come back to the conspiracy realm in a moment here, but just to wrap up things back in the 70s and that era really quickly here, can you tell me a little bit about this cult? It wasn't exactly a Jim Jones type cult now, was it?
Well, they didn't give us Kool-Aid, but
thank God.
I won't mention the cult's name. It's a well-known cult.
Okay.
But they tend to be vindictive. They don't like to be talked about. But it was something that I got into because I had a lot of personal emotional issues, and they seemed to have solutions, some of which did seem to work, and I was pursuing it. But in the long run, I was able to discern that it wasn't delivering what it promised.
Understood.
And that I saw a lot of people really who pretty evil within that cult, and you might say somewhat demonic. And I said, I got to get myself out of here. This is wrong. And at that same time, and actually, when I was in the cult, I read a book called The Korean Gospel of Jesus the Christ, which is a New Age view of Jesus. And I was kind of fascinated by that book, but it was kind of like my first step towards reading the Bible and getting a Christian worldview. But I had to get out of that cult. Things were getting pretty harsh.
Yeah, you saw the writing on the wall, and you got out at the right moment, I would assume.
Yeah, that's pretty much what happened.
Okay.
It wasn't an easy cult to get out of either. They didn't like people leaving, so I kind of had to pull a King David, as they might say.
Right.
King David once got himself out of a jam by pretending to be crazy, so I had to pretend that I was a little bit going off, going on my rocker to get out of there.
I don't blame you. I don't blame you.
I didn't want any payback coming from that particular group later on. So.
Oh, no doubt. Yes.
But then I embarked on going to Christian churches, and also again getting involved with John Birch's side in this whole approach to the New World Order, which was intensely interested in exposing what was quite obviously a shadow government behind the facade of democracy that was running things for its own purposes.
Understood. And there is a name I did want to bring up here, that is Dr. E. Michael Jones. Do you have any opinion on him? I have actually interviewed him before, and I found his story about how he didn't make it to Woodstock. And of course, if I was him, I definitely would have made it one way or another. But go ahead.
Oh, well, E. Michael Jones, I've just seen some brief interview excerpts with him. I did notice on your website you'd interviewed him recently, and I believe, hasn't he written on Zionism? Or am I thinking of a different person?
Yeah, he wrote about that.
Okay. I think I've seen some articles probably linked to in the past to him, where he talks about Israel, what it really is all about in Israel and Zionism, and from a Christian perspective. But I don't have remarks of his fresh in my mind, but maybe Understood. You can fill me in a little bit on what he said in your interview.
He said a lot of things in the interview, but I was just, mildly curious if you had heard of him and what
Yes.
what you believed, what he has been saying for. It seems like he's grown in popularity out of nowhere. It seems like, and he's always been a controversial figure. The media really does go after him for a lot of things that he does talk about on his YouTube channel and all the interviews he does. I'm forgetting the name of the organization, but they've been after him a lot.
Because of his views on Israel,
Right. Yeah, he's just, I guess he's been problematic to some individuals out there, I guess you could say.
And that's because of his views on Israel, or something else?
Yes, primarily.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, Israel's been central to a lot of controversies. You probably know about USS Liberty. They punked us into bombing Libya in 1986 through a Mossad deception. That's all written up in Victor Ostrovsky's book, The Other Side of Deception. He was a former Mossad officer. And I personally believe that Israel was probably the most involved force on 9/11. You know all about the dancing Israelis.
Oh, yes.
Benjamin Netanyahu was very close to Larry Silverstein, who bought the Twin Towers less than 2 months before the event. Philip Zelikow ran the 9/11 Commission as a dual citizen Israeli. Michael Chertoff was put in charge by the Justice Department investigating 9/11. After it happened, his mother was a founding Mossad officer, and all the security at all of the involved airports in 9/11 was run by ICTS, which was a private firm owned by Israelis. I mean, and if you look at 9/11, who benefited? Well, it wasn't the United States. We got a police state and trillions of dollars in war expenditures and thousands of our soldiers' lives lost, and the Middle East Muslims didn't benefit. According to Chris Boleyn, 65 million Muslims have been displaced by these Middle East wars. Of course, countless lives lost over there. The whole Middle East has been turned into chaos. We're talking about Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, now Yemen. And the only beneficiary is Israel, which has stood back and watched as the United States takes out one enemy after another in fulfillment of really an ancient plan that the Rothschilds had for this Greater Israel project, which dates back even before Theodore Herzl began running with the Zionist congresses in the late 1890s. So, yeah, I know that they go after people who are critical of Israel, and
no doubt.
I'm half Jewish myself, but I have no hesitation in saying that Israel is not the friend of the United States. It's a covert enemy for a long, long time going back, and so I haven't read all of E. Michael Jones' comments relative to Israel, but I suspect that he and I are very much in the same camp of thinking.
Yes, I was just going to say, you guys are not too far off in your ideology, and I really like him very much. I think he's an incredible person, and he's very intelligent. And I just remembered, I don't even know how I forgot, but of course the ADL has been after him tooth and nail, to be honest with you.
Well, there's a big crackdown going on. I don't know if I have the quote handy, but there's this new sort of anti-Semitism czar. I'll have to find the quote, but he basically is a Trump appointee, recent Trump appointee, and he's basically, to paraphrase him, maybe I can find the quote. Hold on just a second here.
No problem.
Let me see if I can find it.
No worries.
Yeah, I think I've got it. Okay. No, that's the wrong one. Okay, one more. Okay, we are. His name is Elan Carr, Trump's special envoy for monitoring and combating anti-Semitism. He says, quote, "We're going to focus relentlessly on eradicating this false distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism," end quote. In other words, he's saying that if you're critical of Israel, if you're against Zionism, that means you're an anti-Semite. Well, my answer to that is, what about all the Jews around the world? Brother Nathaniel, Henry Macko are famous examples, but there's a Orthodox Jewish organization called Naturi Karta, which is totally anti-Zionist. And are all these Jews, my father was Zionist, even though he's Jewish. I mean, if you're anti-Zionist and you're Jewish, does that make you an anti-Semite? That's ridiculous. How can you be a Jewish anti-Semite? But that's how he's defining it. And unfortunately, that is kind of reflective of the power of AIPAC and the power of, the Jewish lobby in America and the Israeli lobby. And again, you look at the Middle East wars, they're not doing us any good, but they're certainly doing Israel a lot of good. If you put this into a spiritual context, if you talk about the New World Order and its world government, there's been a plan for a long time that the center of the world government is supposed to be in Israel, in Jerusalem. And that's really what all this stuff about Trump recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel is about. We're moving our embassy there. And Michelle Bachmann, former congresswoman, put up this ridiculous video to the voters of Brazil telling them they should only vote for a Brazilian presidential candidate who will support moving the Brazilian embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And what kind of criterion is that for picking the president of Brazil? But it's very important to these people. And there's a belief within Christian circles, informed Christian circles, that what's going to happen is that the Christian Zionists, they believe that Jesus is going to come back and rule for 1,000 years from a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. Well, it's not going to be Jesus. It's going to be the Antichrist, the figure that's predicted in the book of Revelation. That's who I consider those of us who are better informed on this issue believe. But just to quote David Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister of Israel, he said this in Look magazine, January the 4th, 1962 issue, said, quote, "All other continents will become united in a world alliance at whose disposal will be an international police force." You can see what he's doing there, Michael, is predicting a world government. Yeah. He says, in Jerusalem, quote, "In Jerusalem, the United Nations, a truly United Nations, will build a shrine of the prophets to serve the federated union of all continents. This will be the seat of the Supreme Court of mankind." End quote. So, there's this vision for a long time that there's going to be a world government, which, of course, would be dictatorial once you concentrate all power in one government. All hell's going to break loose. But according to the people at the top of this movement for world government, the capital is going to be Jerusalem. And that's has a lot to do with what's going on in our world geopolitically, even though it may not make sense to a lot of people. It makes sense to the powers that be. They've had this as their goal and focus for a long, long time.
No doubt. And in terms of religion, are there any specific religions that perplex you? For instance, Mormonism and Scientology have always been ones that really bothered me for, obvious reasons. We don't have to go too deep into detail here on those two, but I'm sure already some people out there will be offended just by saying that, just by singling those two groups out. James, what's your opinion?
Well, I think that we're seeing a situation where, if I can refer to Lucifer as a real being, that he knows that people have a spiritual character and it's hard to eradicate it. And what we saw in the 19th century was a proliferation of cults, including Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Christian Science. Is just farther the splintering process. The powers that be have a divide and conquer strategy. That's very clear from their actions over the years. And one of the ways to conquer Christianity has been to divide it. And Martin Luther, however good his reasons were for splitting with the Catholic Church, and I think he had some very legitimate complaints, that resulted in this onslaught of splintering of Christianity. And the British in Britain, the church there was started when the Anglican Church was started because the Pope would not give Henry VIII a divorce, and so he started his own church. And people just in the West started starting their own churches, and the splintering of Christianity was part of that divide and conquer strategy, and which ultimately the Luciferians hope that they will rule. The Bible predicts they will rule, but only for a limited period of time.
Understood. And James, there's another thing I did want to mention here on the interview. Thanks to social media, it is now another tool to police thoughts, another tool for social engineering and manipulation, and a way to ruin someone's livelihood. We've seen all these things sort of crash together. The better part of maybe 5 years now, we've been seeing all these sort of movements, all started on social media, some good, some bad. Lots of times these plans start off with good intentions, but they always end up very ugly. James, do you agree with that?
Well, what are some of the specific movements you're thinking of starting on social media?
Well, I guess I could even, a good example would be, let's just use the Me Too movement.
Oh yeah. Well, to me, one thing I've observed is, the powers that be, they've got this, to use a Massachusetts expression, wicked big population control agenda.
Right.
And let me just
go ahead.
Flip to some quotes. Here we go. Robert McNamara, president of the World Bank, quote, "We can begin with the most critical problems of population growth. As I've pointed out elsewhere, short of nuclear war, it's the gravest issue the world faces in the decades ahead. Either the current birth rate must come down more quickly or the current death rates must go up. There's no other way," end quote. Prince Philip said this, quote, "In the event that I'm reincarnated, I would like to return as a deadly virus in order to contribute something to solve overpopulation," end quote. Ted Turner, founder of CNN, quote, "A total world population of 250 to 300 million, a 95% decline from present levels would be ideal," end quote. And, the quotes just go on and on from the world elite. They want the population reduced. Well, what I've noticed is that, you could go back to war, abortion, eugenics, things like that, but anything, you find that so many of the movements, the feminist movement, creating, hostility between men and women, anything that gets men and women apart, this Me Too movement, there was a cartoon when that reached its peak, where this woman at a Christmas party was standing under mistletoe, and none of the men dared to go up and kiss her because they're afraid they're going to get accused of sexual aggression.
Of course.
And it's kind of ridiculous with the whole Brett Kavanaugh thing, something that happened when he was 17 years old. And, men are afraid now to make any kind of, do a wolf whistle or any kind of expression of sexual attraction.
Well, men are afraid to even stand up for other men, James.
Yeah, and what happens?
Amazing.
Is they're keeping men and women apart by this, and most marriages started with a sexual attraction. Well,
right.
And I think that the transgender movement is part of this too. Homosexual marriage and even sex robots. You can't reproduce if you're having sex with a robot, right?
Sure.
The Me Too movement is, I think, at its root, part of all these things, which are meant to keep families from birthing and from reproduction, and to bring about this population control, which I just give you 3 quotes of dozens that the world elite have had. But I think Me Too is certainly a fake movement. I'm not to say that women haven't been harassed, but
yeah,
the emphasis on it is designed to make men reluctant to enter into a sexual relationship, which usually begins with some kind of flirting, and with a woman.
it started off as a good idea.
Population down. I think that it all seems to tie together pretty clearly when you start to realize that that's the common denominator of all these so many movements has been population reduction.
For sure, and this was a great example of what I meant when there was some sort of ideology, some sort of thought that started off as a good idea and then just turned bad. It turned into women just wanting to get their names out there, and they wanted to profit off of others, really. And a lot of these women that let's bring in Harvey Weinstein, for instance, because he's kind of the one that kicked off a lot of these things. I'm sure we could both agree, James, that he's kind of a scumbag in a way, because, he is from Hollywood, so he's kind of a douche. He's a Hollywood douchebag. Let's be honest here. But I'm pretty sure a lot of these women that put themselves out there and agree to do a lot of the things that he wanted to do, or maybe even they came onto him. I'm pretty sure on some cases, some of these women, they'll do anything to get ahead, especially some of these actresses. You know, the old routine, James. We can't be a fool and act like a lot of times these women weren't willing and ready.
Oh, right. In fact, that's almost probably kind of obligatory for many women in Hollywood to get on the couch with a producer.
Sure.
So, yeah, I'm sure there's no question that many women have been raped and abused, and there are probably women who resisted advances in Hollywood, not wanting any part of it, but others who, like you say, were unscrupulous themselves and
Right.
were party to it. But bottom line, the Me Too movement would receive the propulsion that it did because I believe because it's part of this whole attempt to keep relationships from occurring. You know, when I first read George Orwell's 1984,
Right.
you might recall that the heroine, Winston's girlfriend, Julia, is a member of the Junior Anti-Sex League. And when I read that, I said, gee, that doesn't sound right, because it seemed like the New World Order was pushing sexual liberation. That was true when I was a hippie in the 70s. It was all about sexual liberation.
Yeah.
That was part of the breakdown of the morals that ultimately would lead towards homosexuality, transgenderism, and then feminism and the Me Too movement.
Yeah, that's what actually Dr. E. Michael Jones actually talks about, the sexual liberation movement, it being the cause for a lot of what we see today.
Yeah, it kind of started that way and it just progressed. Actually, it kind of started with the anti-war movement. That's kind of when the culture kind of broke apart during the Vietnam War, and the war protest was kind of the first protest movement that was really taking place significantly. And then these other movements, as the Vietnam War died down, trace their ancestry to that. I firmly believe, having watched it, these things progress.
Understood. And of course, James, I know that you probably have been hit a few times with a few individuals out there trying to drag your name through the mud. We've seen lots of online censorship going on. And even myself, I'm not as popular as you or other individuals out there, but I've had my share of unscrupulous marauders out there trying to hurt this program plenty of times, James.
Making remarks about it online, you mean? Or
sure, just anything to try to stop an individual from doing anything, really trying to spread a certain message. It seems like anyone out there that gets offended, that's what they try to do. They'll try to ruin your livelihood some way or another.
Yeah, and some of those could be paid trolls, people who are actually on a government payroll, foreign or domestic, who are paid to stop anyone who's trying to tell the truth about what's really happening, because there is a very much a deep state, a shadow government, which is international in character, which is seeking this global government and world domination, and they certainly they've started world wars that have killed tens of millions of people. They wouldn't at all scruple or hesitate to hire a troll to bring down someone telling the truth, and they're opposed to the truth. The Bible says the devil's a liar, and it's true. And the mass media, the mainstream media, specializes in fake news and false stories they have for years, and going through all the wars we've been in, we've been deceived into and lied into, and so. Definitely there's a campaign out there to shut down the truth tellers.
No doubt, of course. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because now we are at that portion of the interview where I did want to say you did credit a certain book that really helped you open your eyes. And you already mentioned the name of the book, and that was from none other than Gary Allen. None Dare Call It a Conspiracy. And of course, that is a classic, by the way, especially if you could actually find a physical copy of the book. Definitely keep that around. It's actually a great book.
I used to hand those out at work. I said, hey, I'd work on an evening shift and hand it to the night shift people and say, hey, read this book. That was back in the 70s when it really turned me on in terms of awareness as to what was happening. I was very grateful to run into that. And I know some things were not included in his book, and one reason I wrote The Shadows of Power was to elaborate it on him. I should mention, I guess we haven't gone into this yet, but I have two books out more recently. One published in 2013 called Truth is a Lonely Warrior is designed to be a primer, A to Z primer on the New World Order. So I think I got a list of the chapters here, but we start out by talking about false flags and that led us to war, and then the second chapter is on the powers that be, the CFR, and then the third is on the Federal Reserve, and then it goes on. We have chapters on media control and the environmental movement, which we've already talked about, and one on Freemasonry and one on Zionism and one on 9/11 and one on the arts. And but then after I wrote that book in 2013, my original website was lost, and right after I wrote that book, somebody approached me on LinkedIn and said, "Would you like me to help you build a new website?" I said, "Great." So I started a new website, and I've been blogging since 2014 on that site. And I did release a new book last month. It's called 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw, because as I've continued to write, I've learned new things, and I've expanded on details in Truth is a Lonely Warrior, and discovered things I didn't even know before that aren't in that first book. So they're kind of companion books. It's Truth is a Lonely Warrior and 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw, the brand new one. But those are designed to put the reason I refer to it as a jigsaw puzzle, by the way, Michael, is that people hear me give this analogy 100 times before, but often when you try to just approach people on one issue like chemtrails or 9/11, people say, the government would never do that to us. And if they did, hey, the news media would tell us about it. So you really can't give people just one picture of the puzzle. You got to show the full picture, I believe, to start to convince someone. You have to show them, yeah, the government would do that to us, and done it to us in 100 different ways, and here are the ways. And you know what? The media's not going to tell you, because you know what? Here's who runs the media: 6 corporations.
Right.
And who runs the government? It's not your democratic vote that's deciding our policy, domestic or foreign. It's these hidden oligarchs who have been documented going back decades that these people are running the government. And when you show them the full jigsaw puzzle, then the individual pieces start to make sense. So that's kind of what I've tried to do, is give people as fleshed in a picture as I can of what's been going on.
I love that. And sometimes at the end of this show, I say that we sort of put together the cosmic pieces of the puzzle slightly together every episode here once we get deep into these things. And yeah, James, I agree with you on that. A great book. I actually haven't read it, but I did want to bring that up a little bit later here as we go along. And as you know, on this program, we talk a lot about conspiracies and just about everything else under the sun. And you've done extensive research on various topics like Pearl Harbor, 9/11, the New World Order, as you were just mentioning here. But of course, I do want to refer back to 1969 really quickly here, James, and mention on a previous episode on this program, I brought in another guest who completely dismissed that we went to the moon in 1969. James, I'm not sure if you've ever talked about that anywhere else, but I really do want to hear your opinion if we actually did or not.
Oh, that's a terrific question. I've never written a blog post on that.
Yeah, I've never.
And
don't think so.
I'll tell you. I first heard about that from some friends some years ago, and they referred me to a book. And I went online, started investigating. And to tell you the truth, initially I felt that the people that defended our landing on the moon seemed to have some of the better arguments. I'll give you a couple examples. There was a picture of the astronauts on the moon, and there was a rock that had the number 3 on it. And they said, aha, this is a set prop. Well, a further examination proved that, in fact, somebody just scratched the number 3 on the photograph, And another argument was that shadows were being cast in differing directions, and the sun wouldn't do that. So these had to be studio lamps. But then some guys did an experiment, and they found that when the sun goes over an uneven surface, it does cast shadows in different directions. And so initially I felt that the debunkers did not have the better weight of evidence on their side. But then I began to read John Hamer. He's a British author. He has a chapter on the moon landing. He talked about things like how did they get enough fuel to travel 250,000 miles and back. And if you look at the lunar module, there should have been blast marks underneath it, and it's very tiny. And how did they get the astronauts and their equipment and the rover all into that little thing? And it's a legitimate question been asked. And even, as I understand, the inventor of the camera they used said it could not operate at those low temperatures. And I started to lean very strongly towards the moon landing being fake, because it faked a lot of things. And one great question, by the way, is how come nobody's been back to the moon since, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's such our technology has advanced. You know, we had no home computers in 1969. In fact, It wasn't until 1972 that we had our first handheld calculator. I remember it in 1972. Texas Instruments came out with the first handheld calculator, and I gave it to my father either for Christmas or his birthday. And he was just so delighted to have that. But that was 3 years after. You'd think with all the advance in technology, it'd be easy to go to the moon now. And
Exactly.
you kind of wonder why neither the U.S. or any other country has ever done that. On the other hand, though, just to play the advocate for the other side for a moment, I was somebody who's a major figure in alt media asked me what I thought of the moon landing. And I said, well, I'm really leaning towards it being a fake. And he said, well, he felt it was not a fake. And one reason is that on the moon, the astronauts left these reflectors that you can bounce a laser off of. And he said, I've done that. He said that he had done that experiment himself. And he also said that there was equipment left by the astronauts, which has been photographed even by countries that are unfriendly to the United States. And I said, okay, well, and so to tell you the truth, Michael, I'm a little bit on the fence on this. I lean towards it being faked, at least. This is one thing that strikes me as funny, is that we got this image from the moon, which is a quarter of a million miles away, of the moon landing taking place, and yet in 1969. We couldn't even get a TV signal. I was in Boston. We could get a TV signal from Hartford, 100 miles away.
Yes.
And, I lean towards it, but I'm not 100% certain it was faked. And maybe, some people have suggested that maybe the images we saw were fake, but maybe they really did get up there. I really don't know the answer for sure on that.
Problem.
And that's one reason I've never written a blog post. I'd literally like to be positive before I write one. Again, I lean towards it being a fake. But I'm not sure it was all faked.
It's a complex thing. Well, it's a very complex case, really, because I brought in a guest named Scott Henderson, and he showed me these images that blew me away. There was all sorts of different anomalies that I've never noticed before, and there were one image in particularly was of, I believe, Buzz Aldrin and his watch. And you could see his watch there, and you could see what time it was, and it doesn't exactly match up to the time that was reported that he was even up there. And of course, there's also different anomalies, like there being moisture on the flag and on board of the craft. You're not supposed to find moisture on the window of the craft out there, by the way, James. So it's very unusual. There's these little things like that really do make you wonder. And of course, the technology that we had back in '69, I mean, come on now. I mean, that wasn't that great. So I really do wonder if we actually did ever make it to the moon when we said we did. And I also do feel that we probably did go to the moon, but not in 1969. That's kind of how I feel, James.
Yeah. Well, not to be facetious about it, but somebody pointed out that we hadn't even figured out that we could put wheels on luggage at that point make it
good point.
Transporting luggage at airports easier. I'm not 100% sure. I think that I've heard a lot more evidence in favor of it being a fakery. And when you look at these wag the dog scenarios and how many times we have been lied to over the years, going well before then, even talking, if you want to go to the 60s, talk about Tonkin Gulf, and that fakery.
That's how we got into Vietnam.
So why wouldn't they lie to us about the moon landing and in order to perhaps create an have NASA impress Congress into giving them a lot more money. I don't know the answer on these laser reflectors and these photographs, but those are maybe two facts in favor of the moon landing being real versus quite a few that seem to now be going against it. So I lean toward this being faked, but I just not 100% certain.
No doubt. And it's a very popular sort of theory that's been going on for quite some time now. And of course, moving on now, there's another thing that we can all agree on. And of course, that was 9/11. That was a turning point, in my opinion, for a lot of American people out there. I was very young when the incident took place, and I still have a very good memory of what went on and how the teachers were interacting with us when I went to school. And they were terrified and angry too. And of course, I didn't know why they were acting the way they were, and I actually got in trouble that day. I was threatened to be kicked out of class and sent to the principal's office, all because I said at the end of the day, would it be possible if our government had any involvement? And this was way back after that was the day it happened, on Tuesday. Right at the end of, right in the afternoon, I had asked that in my final period, which would be a 7th period class for those that are curious. That was very, very much at the end of the afternoon there. And that's when I raised my hand and asked the teacher, and the teacher got furious, James.
Well, it's possible you were the first 9/11 truther in history that was punished for questioning the official 9/11 story.
I honestly think so, because at that time I had read things online in between classes, and I kept thinking, there's no way this wasn't orchestrated without some sort of inside assistance. It didn't make sense to me even then as a child. It really did not make sense to me, James. I felt, no doubt, uncategorically, that something seemed wrong, something seemed off. There's just no way this could happen without some sort of help from our government, James.
Yeah, there's no question that it was not the way the government said. One of the anomalies, of course, is that everything inside the Twin Towers turned to dust. That includes every toilet, every piece of furniture. Of 10,000 metal filing cabinets, they were all turned to dust except for one, which was crumpled up like a piece of aluminum foil. Every phone was turned to dust. All the people were vaporized. And, that doesn't happen from a building collapse. And if anyone thinks it was just a building collapse, they need to go and find another building collapse where that happened. This was not something that Osama bin Laden or his 19 alleged hijackers could have pulled off. And of course, you know all about Building 7. And
right.
It's collapsing into its own footprint.
Yeah, we'll jump into that.
Yeah, because of office fires, the government said. But no, office fires have never caused a building to collapse before, a steel frame building collapse, excuse me. And of course, it was not hit by a plane, so they can't use the argument that jet fuel softened or melted the steel.
Yes.
On that one. So there are tremendous anomalies in the government story. We were clearly lied to, and clearly the motivation. It's interesting. I'm sure you've seen that interview with General Wesley Clark, where he revealed to Amy Goodman that there was a plan in the Pentagon in September of 2001 to take out 7 Middle East countries. And we've seen those countries, including Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, already targeted, with Iran now on John Bolton's, his sights are on that country. And Wesley Clark actually said that would be the last one. You've seen that interview, right? With,
understood. Yes, I have, in fact, seen that.
Actually, even prior to that, in the Clinton administration, many of the people like Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith, Donald Rumsfeld, and others were already calling for the taking down of Saddam Hussein. And I quote Pat Buchanan in my book, Truth of the Lonely Warrior, pointing out these neocons that already targeted before 9/11 these countries that Wesley Clark talked about, Syria and Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya, Somalia. So this is part of a plan. And as you know, PNAC, Project for New American Century, put out a battle plan called Rebuilding America's Defenses in the year 2000, which called for a new Pearl Harbor.
Actually,
So
James, to even go back even further back in, I think it was even in August 97, FEMA's emergency response to terrorism handbook depicts the World Trade Center in its crosshairs.
Well, you've probably seen all the Hollywood predictive programming. I think one of the most significant ones is the TV show called The Lone Gunman, which came out with their pilot episode in March of 2001, and it involved an airplane being electronically hijacked with the intention to fly it into the World Trade Center. That was just a few months before 9/11.
That's wild.
That was on TV. But there's quite a few other ones, as you know, The Simpsons, and the Illuminati card game, and the singer Prince had a song, I believe it was in 97, where he said, Osama bin Laden getting ready to bomb 2001, look out. You know, that's some of the lyrics in his song. And there's so many things like that. Even Back to the Future had quite a bit of predictive programming about 9/11 in it. You know, when Marty goes back to his own present time, leaves 1955, when his DeLorean leaves 1955, he leaves two long stripes. But if you look at the screen, the movie screen, there's a neon 9 to the left of the two stripes. It forms a 911. But that's only one of at least a dozen 9/11 predictions that were contained in that movie. Incidentally, the director of that movie, Robert Zemeckis, later made a movie about the Twin Towers called The Walk. And he made it in the year 2000, or released it in the year 2015, which is the year that Marty goes ahead to in Back to the Future Part 2. So there's just all kinds of predictive programming in Hollywood about 9/11. And just
it's a great film, by the way.
It's stunning when you look at it.
A great movie, by the way, that you reference. And in the chat room right now, I actually have a photo of you holding up your book, The Shadows of Power. And below, there's a photo of myself out there looking kind of creepy in that picture.
Oh, from one of your, is the picture put up by one of your people in your chat room?
Yeah, it's in the chat room now.
Okay, all right.
Oh, yes. And of course, I did want to ask you, James, by the way, do you remember where you were Tuesday morning?
Oh, yeah, I was at home on 9/11, but I was very distracted. I had quite a few things going on in my life at that time. My mother was stricken with severe Alzheimer's.
Oh, no.
And my family was dealing with a psychopath, totally separate issue. And on top of that, the night before 9/11, I received some really bad news, personal news. And so when 9/11 was happening, I was kind of in a stupor almost, and was just watching the TV, and I wasn't really thinking analytically about it as you were. But I was at home when it happened.
Ah, okay, no problem. I remember my father woke me up that morning. He was like, look on the TV. He was freaking out as well. It was quite remarkable. That was such a strange time to experience. And of course, I still do remember how things were after 9/11, the underlying sense of camaraderie amongst the American people shortly after the incident. I'm sure you are familiar with that. The sense of unity sure faded away quickly after that, though, James.
Right. Well, actually, not to say that this was necessarily a factor in 9/11, but it's been noted for some time that crises can be used by politicians to unite the population behind a leader.
Absolutely.
Some people felt that John F. Kennedy was trying to exploit the Cuban Missile Crisis to help the Democrats at the election polls in '62. But, George Bush's approval rating soared. I think it was around 90% after 9/11. If you want to get your president to be very popular, just make people think we've been attacked by a foreign entity. It's a great way to do it.
No doubt. And of course, there's been lots of individuals out there, lots of groups out there, alleged truth movement, those sort of groups. These people have made all sorts of false accusations, even at times directed my way. They have accused me of being a CIA agent more than a few times, James, if you could even believe that. And even more prominently, there is a figure out there who I know you're aware of. More than a few times, like I said, I've been accused of this, but this woman out there, and I'm going to name her name, Judy Wood, she's actually accused me of being a CIA agent long ago, and I'm not exactly sure where that stems from. And I like Judy a lot. I think she's done a tremendous job. I think she's very intelligent, but I don't exactly know where that comes from. And of course, that also would lead me to another figure out there, a very strange figure. That would be Rebecca Roth, who I had contact with. I was going to bring her on the program, but I stopped myself from bringing her on the program after I learned a few things about her. What's your take on people like Judy Wood and Rebecca Roth?
Well, first of all, if you were a CIA agent, you must have been recruited very young, because you said you were a child when 9/11 happened.
Well, I mean,
so
I was only
recruiting pretty young in the CIA.
I was only about 15 when that happened.
That's pretty young to be recruited as a CIA agent. There's been a lot of disparate theories, as you know, about what happened on 9/11, and I think that some of them, probably most of them, are honestly generated, but some of them may have been to distract people from the actual scenario. And I've been a believer for some time that 9/11, the taking down of the Twin Towers, was a nuclear event. I should mention that Susan Lindauer, who was a CIA asset, according to her, this CIA had advanced information that there was going to be a attack on the Twin Towers in the form of planes, and they're going to be destroyed by a small thermonuclear device. Benjamin Netanyahu, in his book Fighting Terrorism, published in 1995, predicted a nuclear bomb in the basement of the World Trade Center. And one of the things that led me to believe that there was a nuclear explosion, when I talk about nuclear explosion, I'm not denying for a moment that there were other devices. Everybody knows there were other explosions that took place before the Twin Towers came down or exploded. But it's been pointed out to me by sources from overseas that, and this is valid information, I've written on it, that the type of cancer that first responders get from 9/11,
oh yes,
more than any other cancer in relation to its expected rate, is thyroid cancer. The significance of this is that atomic bombs are the only known environmental source of thyroid cancer. This is why some people keep potassium iodide tablets on hand to protect their thyroids in case of a nuclear attack. Also, the nuclear fission products were found in the World Trade Center dust samples collected by the U.S. Geological Survey. Also, the seismic spike that was recorded by the Lamont Doherty Laboratory of Columbia University, which was not consistent with a building collapse, but was comparable to a nuclear explosion. We're talking about a small nuke, a suitcase nuke that would have been placed in the basement of the World Trade Center. There's quite a bit of evidence that points to that. And if you actually take a look at the North Tower, right before it's demolished, there's a flash of light inside the building. You'll see a flash of flame. And I believe that was to take out the 47 core columns, because, the bulk of weight of the floors of the Twin Towers was not the external wall that you see collapsing. It was the core. The inner core had to be destroyed to collapse it, and I believe that was a small thermonuclear device. I do favor that above the nanothermite or the directed energy weapons. I wouldn't rule those out, but the explosive force as well was consistent with a nuke. The explosion threw chunks of steel weighing multiple tons across the street. You can see pieces that embedded themselves in the American Express building across the street. It was a tremendous explosion, and the high heat as well. There was molten steel, and the fires burning for months after the 9/11 event, and that is consistent with a thermonuclear explosion, which, by the way, reaches millions of degrees at its epicenter when it takes place. So I do happen to personally favor the nuclear hypothesis over these others, and it's interesting to me that nanothermite and the DEW hypothesis came out in late 2006 after a gentleman named William Tahill published a book called, I may not have the name correctly in my mind, but it was something to the effect of the nuclear demolition of the Twin Towers or the World Trade Center. William Tahill, Tahil. After he came out with that book, which explained some of the things I've been explaining to you, then these other theories were advanced, which brought a lot of confusion to the movement. They may be correct, but myself, I do believe that the actual demolition of the towers was most likely thermonuclear.
Understood. In the history of structural engineering, steel frame high-rise buildings have never been brought down due to fires, either or before 9/11. So it really makes you wonder, 3 in one day, how on earth is that even possible?
It's not, and again, that would have been beyond the capabilities of Muhammad Atta and his, amateur hijackers. None of them might have ever even been in a Boeing cockpit before that day. Yet all of whom managed to make perfect strikes, bullseyes on the Twin Towers and on the Pentagon. And by the way, if you go online to YouTube and you look for Pilots for 9/11 Truth, they have a video clip called Airplane Controllability. And they have an interview with a guy named Rob Gavados, who was an FAA official. And after 9/11, he took 10 pilots, 10 experienced airline pilots, and said, guys, let's see if we can hit the Twin Towers. And, the Flight 175, the second plane, they hit the South Tower, was going, according to the FAA, was going at 586 miles an hour. Now, these experienced Boeing pilots got onto a simulator, and this is for a 737, which is much smaller and more easy to manipulate, and not one of them could hit the Twin Towers at those speeds. They had to slow it down to landing speed, which is about 180 to 200 miles per hour. Yet these amateur hijackers, none of whom had flown a jetliner in their lives,
never trained,
believe that they made perfect bullseyes at 586 miles an hour. In the case of the Pentagon, Hani Hanjour was allegedly going at 530 miles per hour. I'm not saying it wasn't some kind of an aircraft. It may have been a drone. And
maybe.
I do tend to favor drones as an alternative, but you cannot, no amateur could have pulled that off. Every one of those pilots made a perfect bullseye. Hani Hanjour struck the first floor of the Pentagon with such finesse that he didn't even scuff the Pentagon lawn. Yet that guy used to burst into tears during his flying lessons, and he couldn't even run a twin-engine Cessna because he couldn't control it at 75 miles an hour. So how does he control a Boeing at 530? It just doesn't make sense.
It doesn't.
For 9/11 to take place, for 9/11 to take place, those plane strikes had to be guaranteed. You couldn't collapse the Twin Towers without having those plane strikes guaranteed in advance, and there's no way those hijackers could guarantee that.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, it's okay. I was just agreeing with you that there's no way that these amateurs would be able to pull off such advanced aerial maneuvers to even position the plane to do that. It's just impossible, really. You got to be, I'm not quite sure, you got to be an expert, I guess you could say, or maybe it was something else, as you alluded to just now. And of course, James, I do have to admit something to you. After 9/11, I really hate to say this, but I did discover Michael Moore, and I really did enjoy his film Bowling for Columbine, which I did see in theater, and of course, Fahrenheit 9/11. And of course, I didn't agree with everything in his films, but I still felt that they were pretty interesting, and they drove a lot of points home. And he wasn't exactly wrong about the links between the Bush family and the Bin Laden family. It's just too bad that Michael Moore was very much affiliated with Harvey Weinstein. He gladly accepted money from him, like many other younger Hollywood actresses. So, Michael Moore sort of turned into a Hollywood D-bag, for better or for worse.
Yeah, well, you're certainly right about, he would have been right about the connections between Bush and the Bin Ladens. In fact,
right.
George Bush Sr. had a oil company, I think it was called Arbusto Energy, and he was partners with one of the Bin Ladens in that. And so the connections between the Bush family and the Bin Laden family are pretty strange.
It goes deep.
And of course, the Bin Laden family was allowed free transport out of the country after the rest of the country was on air lockdown. And shouldn't the Bin Laden family have been kept in this country for at least for questioning about Osama bin Laden, even if some of the family members were estranged from him? So, yeah, a lot of strange connections. And I didn't actually see those Michael Moore films, so
you should.
I don't have an express opinion on them.
Oh, my goodness, you should, James. I think you would actually find them interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of things that I have not read or seen.
That's okay.
There's so much information that's out there in this age of information.
There's too much, and it definitely is overwhelming. The CIA connection runs deep with those two, as well as the CIA's involvement with Middle Eastern countries, Iran in particularly, the true instigators, as I like to refer to them as. It's quite apropos in my opinion. And by the way, James, I do have a clip right now queued up from Donald Trump, an interview he did shortly after 9/11. It might have been a day after 9/11.
Oh, yes, I'm familiar with that clip. Go ahead and play it. Yes.
Yeah, you want to hear that?
Yes.
All
sure.
right, cool. Here we go.
There's a great deal of question about whether or not the damage and the ultimate destruction of the buildings was caused by the airplanes, by architectural defect, or possibly by bombs or aftershocks. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it was an architectural defect. You know, the World Trade Center was always known as a very, very strong building. Don't forget, that took a big bomb in the basement. Now, the basement is the most vulnerable place because that's your foundation, and it withstood that. And I got to see that area about 3 or 4 days after it took place because one of my structural engineers actually took me for a tour because he did the building. And I said, I can't believe it. The building was standing solid, and half of the columns were blown out. I mean, so this was an unbelievably powerful building. If you know anything about structure, it was one of the first buildings that was built from the outside. The steel, the reason the World Trade Center had such narrow windows is that in between all the windows, you had the steel on the outside. So you had the steel on the outside of the building. That's why when I first looked, and you had big, heavy I-beams, when I first looked at it, I couldn't believe it because there was a hole in the steel. And this is steel that was, you remember the width of the windows in the World Trade Center, folks. I think you know, if you were ever up there, they were quite narrow. And in between was this heavy steel. I said, how could a plane, even a 767 or 747 or whatever it might have been, how could it possibly go through the steel? I happen to think that they had not only a plane, but they had bombs that exploded almost simultaneously, because I just can't imagine anything being able to go through that wall. Most buildings are built with the steel is on the inside around the elevator shaft. This one was built from the outside, which is the strongest structure you can have, and it was almost just like a can of soup.
You know, Donald, we were looking at pictures all morning long of that plane coming into building number 2, and when you see that approach the far side, and then all of a sudden, within a matter of a millisecond, the explosion pops out the other side.
Right. I just think that it was a plane with more than just fuel. I think, obviously, they were very big planes. They were going very rapidly, because I was also watching where the plane seemed to be not only going fast, it seemed to be coming down into the building. So it was getting the speed from going downhill, so to speak. It just seemed to me that to do that kind of destruction is even more than a big plane, because you're talking about taking out steel, the heaviest caliber steel that was used on a building. I mean, these buildings were rock solid, and you know, it's just an amazing thing.
And there we go. That was the entire clip there for you.
Yeah, and that's a good one to play for people who might be Trump supporters, but who accept the official 9/11 story. You wouldn't have him making those comments today, I don't think, but that's a great clip, and a lot of valid points that he's making, actually.
Yeah, very interesting that he would come out and say that about the basement, and just a lot of things about that clip. Very interesting. And of course, fast forward to more current times, if I recall correctly, Donald Trump did say that, and I quote, "You will find out who really knocked down the World Trade Center." And this was back, I believe, in February 17th. He did mention that.
Was he leading us on? I think he early on, I can't be sure, but I believe during his campaign he did talk about the possibility of reopening a 9/11 investigation, which may happen, though, as you know. I'm sure you've heard that there's a 9/11 lawyers committee that has now with the U.S. attorney in New York there's now going to be a grand jury impaneled to investigate evidence that the Twin Towers were demolished. And also they've sued the FBI to do a number of things, including to investigate demolition of the World Trade Center, to reveal the camera footage from the Pentagon, and also to reveal what exactly information and the original photographs taken by the dancing Israelis.
Oh, so, by the way, I do have to interrupt you really quickly and just say I made a mistake. That was actually February 15th, 2016, when he made that remark.
That clip you just played of
oh, no,
Donald Trump?
No, when I referred to him saying, you will find out who really knocked down the
Oh, okay.
Center.
All right. Okay. So, but I don't think he's saying anything like that recently. I don't think we've heard any rumbles from the White House about reopening a 9/11 investigation.
Yeah, that quote was from 2016 when he was doing a couple rallies. That's where that comes from. But it seems like he's kind of let us down. He hasn't really exactly addressed that.
No, and that's something that I don't think is going to come from government officials. I think it's going to take people like the Lawyers Committee and
right.
President law. I think using the court system is one way to go about it. You may know that many of the families wanted to sue the government and sue ICTS, but they were all forced. I'm talking about the families of the 9/11 victims. They were all forced to settle out of court, or had to refuse any settlement. But Judge Alvin K. Hellerstein forced them to settle out of court. He was put in charge of those cases, and he protected ICTS. In doing that, the company that ran security at all the airports was Israeli-owned. But his son, Judge Hellerstein's son, worked in Israel as a lawyer for the firm that represents ICTS, so he had a conflict of interest there. These are points that have been brought out, by the way, by Christopher Berlin. Hats off to him for the work he's done.
Yeah, no doubt. And of course, earlier today in the afternoon, I actually had sent you an article that you seem to be quite familiar with. And of course, it mentions the dancing Israelis. I did want to get into that with you here.
Well, I didn't read the complete article, but I'd read another article that referred to those rather redacted photos. You know,
there you go. Yeah.
It shows the photos of the dancing Israelis, but they're kind of whited out, and they don't let you see the faces of the dancing Israelis, so you can't tell what they're obviously in a mirthful mood, but you can't see. It was nice to see the original photos. You can see their faces, and I'm hoping if the lawsuit against the FBI is successful, that we'll be able to see the original photos. We had to see the photos they took of them. You know, they were photographing themselves against the backdrop of the building burnings. They were high-fiving each other. You know what a high-five means? It means sure. Congratulations, we did it, you know. And one of them had a pass to the visitor pass to the World Trade Center. They failed their lie detector test, yet after 2 weeks, the FBI called off their investigation of them, and after 2 months, or approximately 2 months, they were sent back to Israel. Really a shame, because they knew it was happening. In fact, they had their camera set up at 8 o'clock in the morning when the planes in Boston were still on the runway. So they were anticipating this event, and they seemed to apparently expect that it was going to happen. It wasn't like a maybe. They said
they were going to document the event.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah, they were sent there to document the event. And as you probably know, the owner of Urban Moving Systems, the company they work for, fled back to Israel to avoid, being arrested. So, again, the tie-ins to Israel are really amazing. And but the Israelis have a whole history of pulling off false flags and trying to blame it on Arabs. That goes back to the King David Hotel bombing of 1946, where they blew up the King David Hotel. I believe there were 90 deaths in that. And but they went in disguised as Arabs. And 1954, the Lavon affair, they planned to blow up American installations in Egypt, again disguised as Arabs, but that plot backfired. 1967, the attack on the USS Liberty was they attacked the Liberty in unmarked planes, intending to blame the incident on Egypt. And fortunately, the Liberty survived. They torpedoed it, but the ship survived, and they lived to tell the tale. But if you go to 1986, the La Belle Disco, Reagan bombed Libya based on intercepts that came from Libya, but actually that was coming from a Trojan. It was a device, communications device that the Mossad had planted in Libya. And so we've been punked many, many times, or tried to be punked by Israel. And this is kind of the culmination of all of that. This was, I believe, a Mossad Sayeret Matkal, that's their special ops operation to a large extent. Not to deny for a moment that there was CIA involvement and neocon involvement in the Pentagon, people cooperating with it, but I believe at a hands-on level. this was probably more of an outside job than an inside job.
Yes, it's a very complex scenario that went down. And of course, in that article, it has a quote from Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu, who says in a candid conversation recorded 2001, he said, "I know what America is. America is something that can easily be moved to the right direction. They won't get in our way. They won't get in our way. 80% of the Americans support us. It's absurd." And that's coming from Netanyahu, by the way.
Yeah, and that support goes back to in my book, my new book, 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw, and you'll also find it on my website, jamesperloff.com. I've got a post, it's called The War on Christianity, Part 2, and it's called subtitled The Abomination of Christian Zionism, and it goes into the whole history of that movement. The Schofield Reference Bible was specifically crafted and published by Oxford University Press, with millions of copies distributed in an effort to convince Protestants, because the Catholics turned down Theodore Herzl when he asked for the Pope's blessing on the Zionist takeover of Palestine. The Schofield Reference Bible was intended to convince Protestants that the Bible really predicts that the Jews must return to Israel. And I attended churches for many years that promoted that viewpoint, and then I found out its true history and it's falsehood. But Israel is not our ally. It's long been our enemy, covert enemy. But I should mention, by the way, that originally it was not going to be called Israel. They were going to call it the State of Zion, or the Jewish State. And apparently they decided to call it Israel in order to convince Christians that this is the rebirth of the biblical Israel, which it's not at all.
I never knew that.
It's not biblical Israel.
That's remarkable. Yeah. You learn something new every day. And again, I do want to thank you for being a part of the program. We're not ending the interview yet, just by the way. I just wanted to say thank you for being here. It's been tremendous so far. I'm really enjoying this conversation. I think it's pretty apropos yet again. Just a couple of months away from September 11th, another anniversary. And it seems like, James, by the way, all these anniversaries that we've been having the past couple of years now, it seems like there hasn't been that much emphasis in terms of unity here in America, in terms of bringing the people back together under the guise of September 11th, this horrible attack, per se, that happened in the country. It kind of seems like the media now doesn't really play it up as much as they used to.
No, it did bring about a unity. I guess you could say that one of the benefits, unintended perhaps, of 9/11 was that it did temporarily unite the country. It's nice to have the country united, but it united us towards war, unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately.
And I did hear stories of people who were going to get divorced and then decided not to get divorced because such as a great tragedy struck the nations. Quite often out of tragedy, there are some good things that will happen.
Sure.
You know, some people, it gave them perspective. Sometimes tragedy gives us perspective on life and makes us think about things that are what's really important in life. So there were, you know, some benefits of the tragedy, but certainly it was a wicked deception and definitely a false flag, and definitely intended to bring about these tragic Middle East wars, which have just made life so miserable for people in the Middle East, and have also brought about, again, the police state here at home and cost us trillions of dollars. You know, the cost of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan alone, never mind the rest of are involved in the Middle East, those alone would more than pay off all student debt in America.
Yes, sir.
You could fix our infrastructure and fix Flint, Michigan, and the rest of the water supply with all that money we've wasted on unnecessary wars. You know, wars over weapons of mass destruction that never existed.
Never existed.
We're still in Afghanistan after 17 years. We're still spending $45 billion a year there. Well, I'm sorry, 18 years now, $45 billion a year. And the reason we went in there was because they wouldn't give us Osama bin Laden. But according to the official story, he died in 2011. According to the official story, which a lot of us don't believe that story about dumping his body in the ocean.
Yeah.
But if he's officially dead, why are we still there? There's no reason to be there based on the original pretext. I get pretty upset when I hear people say it's for freedom and democracy.
Oh boy,
that's
absurd.
You know, that should have gone out with Woodrow Wilson when he said the world would be made safe by our fighting in World War I to make it the world safe for democracy. But The same old cliches seem to keep deceiving people.
Yes. Well, let's be honest here.
Terrible wars and a great tragedy for America and the world. 9/11, really the crime of the millennium.
Indeed. And George Bush got us into this this terrible war over nothing, over false information. And over the years, during the time, people loved George Bush. They had his back. They were all about him. They would basically strangle you if they could over George Bush if you mentioned any single bad thing about the man. And nowadays, it's almost the opposite. It seems like a lot of people don't like him whatsoever because of his war crimes.
Yeah, well, even if you're totally asleep, you've got a sense that something's wrong with our bombing country after country after country in the Middle East, never in our national interest, and always countries that haven't attacked us. As a matter of fact, I mentioned we've been in Afghanistan for 18 years. Did you know that not one of the alleged 19 hijackers was from Afghanistan? 15 were from Saudi Arabia.
Exactly.
Yet, Trump did an arms deal with Saudi Arabia recently worth up to $350 billion. We have no problem with the Saudis, even though 15 out of 19 were from Saudi Arabia on that hijack. None from Afghanistan, but look at the war we fought against them.
It's ridiculous. It really is. And by the way, I'm curious to get your opinion on this one here. Donald Trump, lots of individuals out there, lots of different circles have been claiming that he, no doubt, is a Zionist. What's your take on that, James?
Oh, no question about it. Long before he became president, he was the first American celebrity to do a re-election campaign commercial for Israeli television for Benjamin Netanyahu. And, the day of his inauguration, he was the first president ever to have his inaugural speech immediately followed by a benediction by a rabbi who spoke of Zion. And that very first day in office, he talked about his antipathy towards Iran. And within a month, he had Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House. And as you know, he's recognized the Golan Heights, which was stolen from Syria by Israel, as belonging to Israel. He's announced that our recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and not Palestine. We have established our first permanent military base in Israel under President Trump. We've done the largest joint military exercises ever with the Israeli military, including a mock attack on Gaza, of all places. It just never stops. Clearly, the powers that be have prioritized foreign policy, and I believe that it's no exaggeration to say that he has continued the neocon war policies of Bush, Obama, and the same mindset as Hillary Clinton and John McCain and Lindsey Graham when it comes to the Middle East. The absurd launching of cruise missiles twice now on Syria over dubious information provided by none other than the White Helmets, who are part of Al Qaeda. It's insane. I've got a blog post. It's called 14 Reasons Why the Syria airstrikes were a really bad idea. For one thing, you can't knock out chemical weapons by bombing them. You'll just spread the chemicals into the atmosphere and kill more people, which was proof positive that his administration knew full well that Bashar al-Assad had not used chemical weapons on his own people. But he's been continuing and up the drone strikes in the Middle East, and it's just continuing under him. So yes, he is definitely a Zionist, and he was bailed out by Zionist bankers, and he evidently owes quite a few IOUs, which has been, he went bankrupt several times, as you know, many of his projects went bankrupt.
Amazing.
Yeah, no question in my mind. Now, that's not to say that there haven't been some good things under Trump domestically.
Sure.
I understand that there's been increased human trafficking arrests, and there have been some cuts in, the tax rates, which are, that's good for the people who get them. Of course, the rich benefited as well, perhaps more than the middle class. But I'm not denying for a moment there have been good things under Trump. But look at his national security advisor. He picked John Bolton, the biggest war hawk from the Bush years. I mean, that's not draining the swamp. I'm sorry. That's implementing the swamp.
Different
but
president.
Yeah, he's definitely a Zionist.
Yes.
I certainly, by the way, I voted for the man. I felt that Hillary Clinton, everything she stood for was things that I opposed, socially, domestically, in terms of foreign policy. And nobody got more money from big banks than Hillary Clinton. So yeah, I voted for Trump. I hoped in the rhetoric, but I'm afraid that, especially when it comes to foreign policy, he has not been an America first. America first, if you study the Lindberghs who coined that phrase, America first means you stay at home and you mind your own business. Doesn't mean you establish hundreds of bases overseas and bomb other countries. That's not what America first is about. It's not about bullying other countries. It's about minding your own business, as the founding fathers advised. Absolutely.
Different presidents, same war. That's what it seems like, James. Truly.
Yes. I think that one reason that they may have favored Trump is that they knew the military would get behind him. You know, he had thousands of people volunteering from the military to act as guards at the White House. That wouldn't have happened with Hillary, you know. And he got a standing ovation at the Army-Navy football game when he was running for president. So, you know, the people like me were hoping in his rhetoric, and that included people in the military. And I believe that the powers that be knew that the military would follow him into continued wars in the Middle East, but would not follow Hillary. And I think that may have been the decisive factor in that last election, and why Hillary did not get the nod, even though she's been loyal to the Rothschild establishment. By the way, under the Clintons, I should mention that Evelyn de Rothschild, who, along with Jacob Rothschild, is probably one of the two most powerful Rothschilds in the world, he actually got the honeymoon at the White House under the Clintons. If that isn't subservience, letting a Rothschild banker honeymoon at the White House, what does that say about you? But nonetheless, Hillary didn't get in. I'm glad she didn't get in. But I love Trump's rhetoric. I love the things he was saying about mainstream media and CNN. That was all good stuff. But you know, when it comes to foreign policy, I believe that's where the game is at, as far as the Rothschild establishment is about, is establishing this third temple in Jerusalem and Greater Israel, and the deconstruction of the Middle East countries that surround Israel. And Trump has been very effective, and along with his allies, Israel and Saudi Arabia, in effectuating that.
Well said. And to go back to what I was mentioning earlier about certain truther groups, there's another one that comes to mind that's architects and engineers for 9/11, which is, of course, led by Richard Gage, who I've brought onto the program various times throughout the years. And when I asked him who exactly was responsible for the attacks, he did not answer, not even in private email. I thought that was kind of unusual.
Well, I think that's one of the disappointments people have had. But I will say that they've done a magnificent job of giving credibility to the 9/11 movement through the signing on of thousands of legitimate building designers, architects, and engineers into the movement. And I've had some very friendly conversations from people there. So, you know, I have good things to say about them, and I think that Richard Gage is a sincere person. But there are people who are disappointed that they have been focused more on the how than the who.
Yeah.
I believe that, you know, if you are engaged in a criminal investigation, if you're a district attorney and you're engaging a prosecution, you concentrate on two things. You concentrate on how the crime was done and who did the crime. You don't sit in the courtroom and just say how the crime was done and not talk about who did it. You have you narrow it down to who the guilty party is. And by the same token, you don't just blame someone without presenting the evidence that convicts that individual. So I think a lot of people would like to see that particular organization be more emphatic in the who, but I'm okay with their approach. And
sure.
I'm grateful that they've lent so much credibility and scientific evidence to the investigation of 9/11 as a crime.
Yeah, I don't exactly see them I don't deem them as a harmful group or anything like that, but definitely would like to see them make more of a point on the who. Definitely. But of course, moving a little bit alongside here, there is another individual, Larry Silverstein, who we know signed a $3.2 billion 99-year lease on the entire World Trade complex just a few weeks before 9/11. And of course, he raked in quite a bit of cash, that Mr. Lucky Larry there.
Well, Larry Silverstein, he invested $124 million, and he was given an insurance payout of over $4.5 billion. Now, for a 2-month investment, less than 2 months, that's quite a return. And of course, he didn't have to deal with the asbestos that was in there. And as you know, according to the New York Times, every morning, Larry Silverstein would have breakfast at the World Trade Center.
That's what I read.
Restaurant, I believe, called Windows on the World. But on the morning of 9/11, wouldn't you know it, he had a podiatry appointment? It was a doctor's appointment.
A doctor's appointment, right. Mm-hmm.
And so he missed the big event. So he lucked out on the event, and he lucked out on a $4.5 billion payout. And he's had more payouts, by the way, even from the airlines have had to pay him dues in the years since then. Tremendous investment. But he was so close to Benjamin Netanyahu. Let me see if I can find the quote. I think I can bring it up for us. Here we go. Now, this is according to the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, November the 21st, 2001, the article Up in Smoke. Quote, every Sunday afternoon, New York time, Netanyahu would call Silverstein. It made no difference what the subject was or where Netanyahu was. He would always call, end quote. So that's the Israeli newspaper itself confirming that how close Netanyahu, who predicted that a nuclear bomb would be placed in the World Trade Center in his 1995 book, Fighting Terrorism, is calling Silverstein. It's not Silverstein calling Netanyahu, it's Netanyahu who goes to Silverstein during these weeks, these few weeks that Silverstein owned the World Trade Center. Well, he still owns it now, but the original World Trade Center, he owned it for less than 2 months. Just remarkable. But there are many examples like that. And of course, his children were supposed to be there that morning. They also lucked out. They weren't there either.
They were very lucky.
But just too many things about Silverstein that any criminal investigator would immediately point a finger and say, who benefits, right? Who benefits?
Right.
One of the first, in a murder case, for example, one of the first things that a police detective will ask us, well, was there an insurance policy on this person who mysteriously died? And who was the beneficiary? Well, who was the beneficiary of 9/11? Geopolitically, it was Israel, but financially, among the people who shorted the stocks and stole the gold and the Brady bonds, et cetera, Larry Silverstein.
Amazing.
$4.5 billion. You can't. That's a tremendous return.
It really is. It really is. And of course, there's another individual out there who I can't believe he's still on TV, and that's Mayor of America, Rudy Giuliani. Another man who, when I saw him talking about how others lie, I thought, well, Rudy, aren't you the biggest liar?
Yeah, he made it a crime to photograph the World Trade Center after it happened, and yet he said it's a crime scene; you can't be photographed.
Oh my!
Yeah, yet he allowed the steel, which was part of the crime scene, to be hustled off to China very, very quickly.
Yes, and of course we did mention this earlier here. Your new book is out, 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw, Solving Political, Cultural, and Spiritual Riddles, Past and Present. Again, I must confess I have not read the book, but I definitely will pick up a copy, as you covered some extremely fascinating topics. And I was looking at the back cover of your book online, and I saw something that drew my attention, James. Yes, you wrote Making Sense of the Supernatural, Aliens, UFOs. Can you possibly expand on that? That caught my attention.
Okay, sure. Yeah, the subject is one that I kind of tended to avoid over the years, because for a long time I felt that, pardon me, I'm just shuffling some papers.
That's okay.
Some quotes.
Don't worry.
There was a think tank back in the 1960s. It was called, the report leaked from, it's called Report from Iron Mountain. And they were talking about ways to control the population. And one of the ways they explored was a fake alien invasion. but they said that the technology was too primitive in the 1960s, and they just didn't see any chance for that. And their final solution was to control the population through environmental threats. And I was familiar with Project Bluebeam,
Sure,
which Serge Monast had talked about before his death, untimely death. He talked about it in 1994, where they would use holograms of UFOs to fool the public. And, Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton both talked about how you could unite the world through an alien invasion. And that's been hashed over as a way to create world government, which is, we know that's one of their goals, is to have a world government. One way to unite the world population into such a government would be an alien invasion, real or faked. And so for a long time, I thought that UFOs were probably just a black budget Pentagon psyop, But then a person in the 9/11 movement, a friend of mine, directed me through the work of L.A. Marzulli.
Oh, yes.
Christian ufologist. He studies many things besides UFOs. He studies giants and things of that nature. But his work was very credible, and he pointed out to me that very credible people have encountered aliens and UFOs. And I have a friend who I used to go to Bible study with. He's a former Air Force guy, and he said that when they were on a bombing run over Vietnam, they had a UFO running right beside them one time. It was right on their radar screen too. The thing took off at thousands of miles per hour. Well, that's no psyop. So I started looking at this, and I realized that we are dealing with what I believe is a spiritual entity. And I do believe that the Bible describes it. There's a verse in the book, Genesis 6.
Are you referring to Ezekiel's wheel?
Well, actually, this is before Ezekiel, but
yes.
Genesis 6, it says, it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth and daughters. Ethiopia's canon of the Bible, and it's quoted in the Bible, actually. And Jasher and Jubilees are mentioned in the Bible, although they're not part of the canon of Scripture. And they make it very, very clear that there were giants born of union between the angels and men. For example, Jasher says, this is chapter 4, verse 18, quote, the sons of men in those days took, I'm sorry, wrong verse. Let me give you another one. This is from Jubilees 5, 1-2. Quote, and it came to pass when the children of men began to multiply on the face of the earth and the daughters were born to them, that the angels of God saw them on a certain year of this Jubilee, that they were beautiful to look upon, and they took themselves wives of all whom they chose, and they bare unto them sons, and they were giants. Now, I'll have to find the specific verses, but Jasher and Enoch both confirmed there was definitely a mating between these fallen angels and women that created a race of giants. And one thing that L.A. Marzulli and other researchers have found is that many skeletons of giants have been dug up, but they've been suppressed. Smithsonian destroyed them, but there were quite a few dug up right here in North America and also overseas as well. Of course, the Bible talks about giants, and the most famous of them was, of course, Goliath, but there are several others that are described within the Scripture. So, in fact, when Moses brought the Hebrews out of Egypt to the Promised Land, the Hebrews were afraid to go in because of the giants that were there. They said that these men were as grasshoppers in their sight, and so, per the Bible, they were forced to wander in the wilderness for 40 years because they were disobedient to the commandment to enter the land. But another thing you've probably noticed, I'm sure everybody has, is that there's been a whole bunch of alien movies. Originally there were comedic films back in the 50s about creatures from outer space, but then they got very serious in the 70s when they made E.T. and Close Encounters of the Third Kind and Star Wars, and ever since got all these alien movies that kind of normalize the idea that there are creatures from another galaxy coming here. Well, I believe that these aliens are in fact these fallen angels. They did have high technology. These ancient books are clear about that. And I believe that if they do arrive here again, they're going to claim that they are creatures from another galaxy. But I do believe that they are the fallen angels. It's interesting that if you look, the Bible talks about demons and Jesus casting demons, evil spirits out of people, that they make it very clear that these evil spirits are not the same thing as fallen angels. They are the spirits of the Nephilim, the giants, the offspring. In fact, this is the verse I was starting to quote from Enoch, chapter 15, verse 8, quote, "But now the giants who are born of the union of the spirits and flesh shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, because their dwelling shall be upon the earth, and inside the earth evil spirits have come out of their bodies, because the day that they were created from the sons of God, they became watchers. The first origin is a spiritual foundation. They will become evil on the earth and shall be called evil spirits," end quote. So I believe that there is a demonic and fallen angel aspect to this UFO alien phenomena, that these creatures are not good guys. I don't believe they're going to save us. I know that there have been alien movies to that effect, that they're really going to save us from nuclear weapons and stuff like that. But my view is that I believe there is probably a Pentagon PSYOP involved in all of this, and that they may be a PSYOP intended to unite us into a world government as a result of this. But I believe at some future point that these fallen angels will return in force, that this will be marketed what the Bible calls the end times, and we might even receive a return of these giants, these Nephilim, who I believe are referenced by the superhero movies that we've seen. You have superhero movies along with alien movies, and I believe those are references to fallen angels and to the demons, but the Nephilim. But anyway, I've said enough. I'm sure you have more perspective than I do, because I've only written one post and one chapter on this. So some people spend their lives on this stuff, studying crop circles and phenomena like that. I have not gone into it, but just from my investigation of what L.M. Marzulli and a few other people were saying, that's kind of my perspective on it. But you go ahead, because I know you must have had many fascinating guests who have discussed this topic. Don't know if we got cut off there.
Yes. For why I keep the weirdest thing in the world. I'm not sure why the microphone keeps going out here. There's nothing wrong with my microphone, by the way. It just seems like this just me for whatever reason. Chat room, can you hear me now, by the way? I could still hear the guest as well. Very, very strange. And James, can you hear me, by the way?
I can hear you fine.
Oh, okay.
I'm getting that echo again that I mentioned earlier. Hopefully that.
And James, do you hear me now? Or did I lose you, James?
Oh, no, I'm here. I can hear you, but just getting this echo, like I said.
Yes, I understand. I definitely needed to leave that thing on for a moment just to make sure if you could hear me or not. So, it's on by now.
You were breaking up a little bit.
Are we back on the air now?
I can hear you fine right now.
Okay, you can hear. Strange. I don't know what there yet again, ladies and gentlemen. Now you should probably be able to hear me ever so slightly. James, can you hear me this time?
I can hear you fine right now. Yeah.
Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, I do apologize. I'm not quite sure what is going on here. We obviously weren't disconnected. Everything is going well. I'm actually using a backup microphone right now that keeps being cut off. I'm not quite sure why. It seems like this program that I'm using called Streamlabs, it seems to not be going so well, but now the audio is coming in and the listeners out there finally are able to hear us both now, James. So thank God.
Okay, good. That's good. Well, I don't know how much you or they heard, but I kind of finished up what I was saying about my view on aliens, UFOs. I tied it to spiritual things, and then I asked you for your own view, because I know you must have had many guests on to discuss this issue.
Yes, it's a very unusual issue, and over the past maybe 4 or 5 years now, we've seen the popularity in ufology seem to have this meteoric rise, but as you know, history seems to repeat itself. If you look at your newspaper or online, you see all these headlines of things like China and Russia and Iran, and it's basically like history really is repeating itself, James. Wouldn't you agree?
You mean as far as wars go?
That too.
There are potential for wars?
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, history has repeated itself many times, and actually, I did a PowerPoint talk recently at the Watertown, Mass. Public Library called War and Deception, where I went through every war that America's been deceived into, starting with the Spanish-American War of 1898, and showed that pattern. You know, if you look at the Spanish-American War, which is the one, of course, where we went to war with Spain over Cuba, and really the main trigger event was the sinking of the Maine U.S. battleship in Havana Harbor. That war had all the things we see in wars today. You had a false flag sinking to the Maine. You had fake atrocity stories. You remember the baby incubator stories that helped get us into the Gulf War of '91, or at least you probably have seen the material on that.
Yeah.
The yellow press, just newspapers back in those days, no television, no radio, but the yellow press was building up these stories of how the Spaniards were roasting priests in Cuba and throwing the people to sharks and stuff like that, and getting the American people all outraged over the freedom and democracy of the people of Cuba, when in fact oligarchs up here in America wanted to get control of that their sugar industry, which is the largest in the world at that time, and their whole at least half a dozen motives for that war, none of it having to do with freedom and democracy at all. But the other thing that is common to today's wars is that the White House was controlled by the bankers. The President, William McKinley, had gone bankrupt when he was governor of Ohio, was bailed out by the Rockefellers, well, I should specifically a group of businessmen led by Mark Hanna, who was the front man for John D. Rockefeller. And then Mark Hanna became McKinley's political manager. And from then on, the Rockefellers were calling the shots. And but that war was not fought for freedom and democracy. But I went through the in that PowerPoint, again, you see it on my welcome page of my website, Perloff.com. Yeah. It's Perloff. I went through the invasion of Veracruz, 1914, which was the benefit of Standard Oil. World War I with the sinking of the Lusitania, another false flag, done for multiple purposes, and besides war profiteering, of course, the creation of the League of Nations, overthrow of the Tsar, redrawing of the whole map, the destruction of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Balfour Declaration, the creation of the Palestine Mandate, which would turn into Israel. Then you World War II. I talk about Pearl Harbor, the fact that it was provoked, and the fleet was put by Roosevelt in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, contrary to all naval advice, as bait for the Japanese to attack. And there was complete foreknowledge of the attack in Washington, which was not shared with our Hawaiian military commanders. And that's covered in my article online, Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt's 9/11. And it's also a chapter in my new book, 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw. And by the way, I've been writing on Pearl Harbor since 1986, when I wrote a cover story for the New American on it. So my background, then that goes back a long ways. But then I in this PowerPoint talk, I went through the Korean War, how it was artificially orchestrated in order to validate the UN and to remove Congress's authority to declare war, because, you know, we fought that war under UN mandate, no declaration of war at all. Congress wasn't even consulted. And then the whole Tonkin Gulf episode and the Vietnam War, sending 58,000 American soldiers to their deaths over an incident that never even happened. And then we got up to Reagan bombing Libya in 1986, which we've already discussed, but that was when the shift changed from the Cold War to the War on Terror. That was the change of focus that began at that time, and that was followed by the 91 Gulf War and baby incubators, and then, well, of course, it was Kosovo, but the big one, of course, was 9/11, which led to all those wars that were accurately predicted by General Wesley Clark, including the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, the bombing of Libya, and now the bombing of Syria, and ultimately, if John Bolton gets his way, to perhaps a war with Iran.
Hopefully not. And of course, switching gears ever so slightly, just because of time issues here, James, and I do apologize, but I did want to switch gears very slightly here. I wanted to mention Hollywood, and the past few years, like I mentioned way early on in the program, the real corruption and sexual perversion of Hollywood has come to light. For years, many people were saying all sorts of things, how many individuals that run in certain circles in Hollywood. And of course, that brings us to the sex cult NXIVM. They've made plenty of waves out throughout Hollywood. Even though they're not exactly based out of Hollywood, they still have many connections there. And recently that came more to light when popular actress Allison Mack from that TV show Smallville was popped. That's when everything sort of came to light. Any opinion on that group in particular, James?
I should probably just ask you how late we'll be running. I apologize for
Don't worry.
interrupting your question.
That's
but,
okay.
It's
We're almost out of here.
It's 12:25 where I am in the morning where I am right now.
Oh yes,
were you planning to go to 12:30 or 1 o'clock?
Oh no, we're gonna wrap this up pretty soon here.
Okay, all right. Well, I have to acknowledge that I don't follow the Hollywood scene too closely. When I was young, and the content of Hollywood movies was a lot more moral. I was kind of an avid movie fan, so
Sure.
people like John Wayne and Cary Grant and Marilyn Monroe and people, that whole era when I was growing up, into the 70s with people like Michael Caine. But it seems like it's really gotten satanic in recent years, and I've heard about snuff parties and pedophilia in Hollywood and really grotesque stuff. And I know that some of that stuff went on in the old days, but I think it's really gotten to a new level. And Academy Awards seem to be handed out largely for political reasons. Not that they weren't in the old days. I know very well of some examples of that. In fact, I have a chapter in my new book, 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw, has one called The Mystery of the Best Picture Oscar, and that's a reference to the 1947 Best Picture Oscar. But to be sure, Hollywood is under the control of the powers that be. It is Luciferian, no doubt about it. And there's even a TV show on TV now called Lucifer, which makes out Lucifer to be a good guy who helps out, basically a good guy who helps out the LAPD solve murders, stuff that never would have been considered. And in fact, I do have a chapter in that new book, 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw,
Nice.
On the golden age of television. And that was the era of I Love Lucy and The Honeymooners and Leave It to Beaver. And back in those days, television was extremely moral. Every show had some kind of moral lesson to be learned, and there was no cursing, no sex, no graphic violence. But all that was done to get the TVs into the homes. In fact, I even quote the founder of the Church of Satan, Anton LaVey.
Right.
And here's, let me just give you what he said about television. Quote, he said, TV's infiltration has been so gradual, so complete, that no one even noticed. People don't need to go to church anymore to get their morality plays on television. What began modestly as rabbit ears on the top of family TV sets are now satellite dishes and antennas brightly dominating the skyline, replacing crosses on tops of churches. The TV set or on satanic family altar has grown more elaborate since the early 1950s. And he goes on. But anyway, that quote is from Anton LaVey's 1992 book, The Devil's Notebook.
Right. And
no question that it started out as innocent entertainment in order to entrap people into getting these mediums of these message boxes into their homes. But then they just boiled the frog and gradually tweaked the content so subtly that people didn't even know that they'd been they'd been deceived. But to get a mouse to go into a trap, you got to put cheese in the mouse trap, and the cheese was that these TVs were wholesome and they're going to teach your children good lessons, and it was going to all be like Leave It to Beaver and the Andy Griffith Show. It's going to be good stuff forever, and it wasn't. Hollywood is definitely a place where you won't get ahead if you don't cooperate. And there's some people believe that I haven't studied modern Hollywood too much, but some people believe that some of these big stars who suddenly die mysteriously had to sign some kind of satanic contract to get their stardom. and part of that contract was probably that eventually they would get wiped out themselves. I don't know if that's true or not, but it wouldn't surprise me, just given the level of morality or immorality that exists in that venue.
Yeah, no doubt. There's all sorts of weird things involved with that one particular group out there, based out of New York, that Nexium group. They were getting large donations. They gave large donations to Hillary's camp, if I recall correctly. So, I mean, that should be no surprise.
She was tied into John Podesta and that whole, Pizza Gate thing. So,
yes,
that's not surprising.
There's a lot there. And of course, as we are closing up here, there is another individual out there who I'm sure you can agree. Well, maybe I don't exactly know where you reside with this one. Of course, the biggest pop star of all time also took a hit. Most recently, a documentary came out again on one Michael Jackson. I'm not exactly sure what your opinion is on Michael Jackson, but I would love to hear it.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if he was taken out, but I have to, as I say, I have not studied it. I became so turned off by the developments in pop music and Hollywood that I sort of stopped watching and listening, and I have not followed closely the circumstances of Michael Jackson's death and life. I know there was a lot of weirdness connected with it, but I just don't have an intelligent, informative or edifying opinion to give you. I'm sure you could tell me a lot more than I could ever tell your audience.
No problem. It's just a very strange individual, I would have to say, in terms of a lot of things that have come to light. But of course, we won't have to go too deep into it. I would just say that there was some sort of documentary that came out. There's two individuals who said all these things about him. Probably some of that wasn't exactly fact. That was probably made up. However, I'm sure there's lots of things that did go on that aren't exactly made up. I don't care what anyone says. If you are the age of 30 and you're sleeping with children that aren't your own, there's something psychologically wrong with you. Whether or not he touched any of these kids, it doesn't exactly make it right. And James, I'm not even a parent. But if any adult asked me if it was okay for my child to sleep in their bed, I wouldn't exactly agree whatsoever. I'd probably catch a case if I was asked that sort of thing. James?
Yeah, I think that, again, I think to move ahead in pop music in Hollywood, it's pretty much a requirement now that you're going to do some pretty degraded stuff.
Maybe groom that way, yeah.
Compromise your soul, more or less, if you want to get ahead. I don't think you're going to be able to lead a wholesome lifestyle and get the stardom that so many people covet. It's too bad. I think that the arts can be very positive, that they can present moral messages. I mean, look at the movie It's a Wonderful Life, very uplifting spiritual film that brings joy to people's heart. At least, well, not to everybody. I mean, everybody has movies they don't like, including that one. But it's just an example of how the arts can be used in a positive way to reinforce, the value of life. But unfortunately, today, due to the power of money, which the central bankers have put in their own hands through,
Sure.
I'm sure you heard the famous Rothschild quote: "Give me the power to create money, and I care not who makes the laws of a nation." Just paraphrasing there, but through the power of money, they've gotten control over so many entities, including Hollywood, that there's not a lot. Not saying that nothing good comes out of Hollywood, but and there aren't positive films that still come out, but because they still need to rope in some of those more moral people out there. But to be sure, I think that the overriding undercurrent in Hollywood is a Luciferian one, no doubt about it.
Amazing. And of course, as we close here tonight, I did want to get your opinion on one last thing, and that's with the political spectrum that we have before us. We have the 2020 elections not too far off. They'll be here before you know it. And we've seen a number of Democrats step up to the plate. I'm curious if you think any of them would actually Trump, in other words.
I don't know. It's I don't think they've got a viable candidate yet. Joe Biden's got these
he's got the lead.
All these gropings that alt media was picking up on for years, and suddenly the mass media, mainstream media, discovered them. I don't think they've got a viable candidate yet, and I think it's going to depend on the geopolitical situation. If Trump has sort of completed his mission, foreign policy-wise, they may decide that it's time to switch back to the Democrats in order to advance their domestic agenda, which I think the Democrats would be better at doing. So I don't know that they've even made up their own minds yet at this point. I don't have any shot to call on that.
It might be Biden.
Yeah, I'm sorry?
I said it might be Biden.
Oh, yeah. Well, what's your own thought? Do you think he'll win? That Biden would be brought in as the candidate and as the winner?
It kind of seems that way. It seems like the Democrats have pretty much rallied for Biden. It seems like he might be the candidate that everyone agrees with that will go heads up with Trump there. And to be honest with you, I'm not quite sure if he even has a snowball chance in hell, to be honest with you. And this is coming from someone who is bipartisan. I go after both Democrats and Republicans if it's deserved. And I haven't exactly been 100% on the Trump bandwagon per se. I've always had my issues with his affiliation with Goldman Sachs and, of course, his affiliation with convicted pedophile Jeffrey Epstein. That's always rubbed me the wrong way. There's a few other things, but I'm not exactly anti-Trump. I'm just anti-corruption.
Right.
That's all.
Well, he had that in common with Bill Clinton, that association with with Jeffrey Epstein.
Yep.
Yeah, I think it would be very easy for them to elect either party. They could easily bring down Trump simply by bringing about a stock market crash prior to the election and a downturn in the economy and get everybody sour on him. But if they wanted Trump to stay in office, they just have to, pump some more inflated currency into the economy to stimulate things and make things look good and make people feel happy. And besides that, they can probably rig the voting machines anyway. So even that may not make that much difference. But yeah, I think it's going to depend on whatever they decide in their hidden enclaves, where the world is at and how close they are to getting the world government. If they think that Trump is the right man to carry their agenda forward, the best man for that, they'll stick with him. But if not, they may go with a Democrat. Well, it's too early to call that.
Right. Incredible. And again, James, I do want to thank you so much for being a part of the program. And of course, if there's anything you want to get off your chest or plug, the floor is yours, my friend.
Oh, well, I appreciate that very much. Well, my website is jamesperloff.com. It's Perloff, and a lot of blog posts there. On my welcome page, I've also got video and audio interviews I've done with other radio programs. And again, my newest books are Truth is a Lonely Warrior, came out in 2013. That's not exactly new, but it's a primer on the New World Order A to Z, or I thought it was A to Z, but I've supplemented that with my newest book, 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw. It's a companion book that elaborates on and fills in, like, for example, the first book did not talk about Wi-Fi and those dangers. This new book does, through an interview with wireless educator C.C. Doucette. So we talk about 5G and smart meters, things like that, things that I didn't cover in the first book. So those are my newest books that are out there, hopefully to educate and edify the public. I'm on Twitter as James Perloff. And I am working on a book on 9/11, but I've made enough mistakes in 9/11 because it has so many rabbit holes. It's coming along slowly because I want to make sure I've got it right when I finally do publish. Still conflicting theories that I myself am undecided about. And we touched a little bit about that earlier in the show. So that book is just coming along real slow.
Perfect. James, I do want to say thank you yet again for being a great guest, very informative. I enjoyed the conversation greatly, and we'll definitely have to do it again in the near future.
Oh, well, thank you, Michael. I look forward to that. You've been a great host, and I don't know how young you are, but you said you were 15, in when 2000 when 9/11
I think
happened.
I was.
So I guess I can kind of figure out you're in your 30s. Okay.
I think I
So,
was about
you know,
14 when that happened.
oh, okay. Well, hats off to you for being younger and as well informed as you are, and taking the initiative to start your own radio live stream broadcast and getting informed and informing your audience on the issues. And I'm always pleased when I see, you know, I'm older myself, but I'm always pleased to see people who are younger who aren't, you know, just into their smartphones and, you know, into what are the latest TV crazes, but are actually serious about the issues and serious about doing something about what's wrong in our world.
No doubt. Definitely appreciate the kind words, and I'll see you again in the near future, my friend.
Okay, very good.
All right.
Good night to you
Good
then,
night.
Michael, and good night to the audience.
Yes,
Appreciate
sir.
They're listening in, and despite our technical
Oh, yes.
difficulties.
I do want to say thank you so trouble with the microphone here. I'm not quite sure why. It seems like things were going in and out there, but it seems like you guys in the chat room were able to pick up on that. So I don't know if he actually heard me or not saying bye to him there, but regardless, he was a great guest. That was Dr. James Perloff, boys and girls. Amazing. And of course, when I return from a break, I will have to go find the other guest that we do have in store here for you. So let me go fetch him. And of course, this is a great time to go to the bathroom. If you'd like, I recommend it. I need to go myself. So with that said, I'll be right back, ladies and gentlemen. Amazing. And welcome back to the program. Thank you so much for sticking around, boys and girls. I do apologize greatly for all the trouble that has presented itself tonight. All kinds of things went wrong here, boys and girls. It's awful. However, the show must go on, and I believe I have found my guest. Let's bring him in.
Awful.
Oh,
however, the show must go on.
Oh, I'm hearing myself now repeat there. I'm hearing the show with you, Frank.
Okay.
Awful.
Oh, yes.
The show must go on.
Definitely.
Myself now repeat there. I'm hearing the show with you, Frank.
Okay.
Double time there, Frank. I'm not sure what was that all about there, but I do want to welcome you to the program. Thank you so much for being here with all of us here. I do appreciate it.
Not sure what was that all about, but I do want to welcome you to the program. Thank you so much for being here with all of us here. I do appreciate it.
Background chatter there.
It does seem like we're in a feedback loop, but let's make the most of it.
Oh, that's a really bad
that's weird.
Feedback
loop
there.
Hard to know when to jump in.
Yes, that's not good. Are you on a cell phone?
I am not.
That is weird.
Yes, that's not good. Are you on a...
I'm having a hard time hearing you, Frank. Do you have the program up online somewhere?
I do.
Oh, yes.
I'm having a hard time hearing you, Frank.
You definitely have to turn that off, Frank, by the way.
I'm not doing anything. Oh, I see.
Yes.
Now I get it.
There you go.
I had the show on.
There you go.
Okay.
Yes,
I
sir.
think we're good.
Yes.
My apologies.
That's okay.
I had the link.
That's okay. Don't worry. It happens every now and then. You definitely don't have to. I have that on in the background. That's when the audio will be feedback there. Yeah. And of course, looking at the chat room, making me laugh there with their comments. But yes, again, I do want to thank you so much, Frank, for sticking around here. All kinds of issues were going on with the program even before you came on. And when I was trying to get you on here, I was still facing all sorts of issues. We were dropping in and out. It was pretty incredible, Frank.
Maybe it's the subject matter.
I don't know. I really don't know. Maybe I need new cables. I'm not quite sure. But we'll find out as we go along here. And again, I do want to thank you for sticking through the mess. And welcome to End of Days, the Michael Deacon program, where things usually go well at this hour on the program. But as you know, technology will fail.
Indeed.
Yes, sir. So as we continue here tonight, Frank, can you tell us a little bit about yourself as we begin?
Certainly. I'm an architectural historian in Canada. I have made it a passion to look at buildings and the built environment in such a way that, in particular, I look at coded language systems in art and architecture. I wrote my PhD on the history of Freemasonry and have quite a desultory academic background exploring the arcane, whether it's early Christian origins or alchemy and Kabbalah or the manifestation of symbolism in art and architecture.
Understood. And I forgot to mention, how are things out there in Canada, Frank?
What do you mean, politically or climate?
Oh, well, just in general, how are things out there? Not politically.
Okay, good. It's great. We're the very younger brother to the United States.
Yes, you are in Winnipeg, if I remember, the gateway to the West.
That's it. That was the destined purpose of Winnipeg. It's the geographical center of North America, and it had two great attributes going for it, at least 100 years ago, which was that it was the nexus for most of the railway systems going north, south, east, and west. And secondly is that we had a lot of fertile ground for wheat cultivation. So
right.
It became the gateway to the west for wheat.
Or Chicago the North, minus the violence.
You got it. I mean, no, we have our fair share of that too, but that is the form of self-puffery that Winnipeggers often refer to themselves, that we're the Chicago of the North.
Yes, due to Chicago's architecture style of the 1800s, 1900s, if I recall correctly.
That is exactly the case. We have, in many ways, a historic footprint of Chicago-style School of Architecture buildings here, largely represented by great Chicago architects that came to Winnipeg to work on projects.
Of course, I think we were cut off there for a moment, but I think the audio came back around. Thank God. But yes, now people can hear me and hear you. And Frank, were you born in Winnipeg?
I was.
Okay, you were born in Winnipeg. All right. I thought perhaps you might have gone there at maybe an early time in your life.
No, I started off here, and then I held a number of academic positions abroad in Europe, but came back when I had the opportunity of opening the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, as I'd been asked to be a consultant for a group of First Nations elders that had an opportunity to include their history and culture in the first museum of its kind. It's called the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. It was erected in Winnipeg in 2014. So I came back and worked very closely with the Indigenous content in the museum. So that was a great honor that brought me back home.
Interesting. And what exactly got you interested in architecture, I should say, in the architecture field?
Well, it happened by sheer accident. About 20 years ago, I spotted, rather curiously, 2 Egyptian sphinxes on the roof of the Manitoba Legislative Building, what you would call the Capitol Building, and it resulted in the discovery of what is celebrated British genius and Freemason named Frank Worthington Simon, and he spent his life in the recovery of what he called the lost principles of ancient architecture. And on the surface of the building, it is very standard Beaux-Arts neoclassicism. Ionic columns, pediments, domed rotundas, features like that. But what made this building stand out for me is at the same time I was studying ancient Near Eastern languages and Near Eastern cultures, which are largely predicated on, at least archaeologically speaking, the study of temples. And to me, it became rather clear that the architect was employing ideas that came directly from temples, and not just ornamentally speaking, but also the ideology. So having spotted these sphinxes on the roof, it can't get any more romantic than that. I just spotted a sphinx, tried to answer the riddle of the Sphinx, and little did I know that this building was a masterwork of an esoteric genius who had a command of biblical languages, was initiated into Freemasonry, and had used this building to encode and include about 5,000 years of architectural history, hidden hieroglyphic inscriptions, numerological codes, geometrical patterns, things like that. And it was such a cryptics for me that I ended up taking, I think, about 4 graduate degrees trying to get into the mind of this dead British genius, and that sent me around the world. So I had no vocation for architecture. I draw stick figures very proficiently, but studying this building ended up becoming a lens into a wider world of esotericism and coded language systems in art. So it started from that, and then everything since there has sort of ballooned into various other interests related to cryptography.
Winnipeg seems to have very interesting buildings. You might have lost me, folks.
Momentarily.
Am I back now?
You are back.
Okay, perfect. Yes, I was just saying that Winnipeg has some very interesting buildings, and specifically the Manitoba Legislative Building. No surprise it would be set up to represent Solomon's Temple, as they usually are.
No, I wouldn't say usually are. This building is wholly unique in that front, because to crib from Solomon's Temple, you have to have a fairly robust knowledge of the Book of Kings, Old Testament book describing the temple and its construction. That said, in Masonic mythology and liturgy, if you want to call it that, and ritualization, Solomon's Temple is the key ingredient to the amelioration of society and the betterment of humankind. So the temple acts as an allegorical path towards virtue. But in this particular building, there are rooms that incorporate, or a room that expressly incorporates King Solomon's Temple, but blends it with a very sophisticated knowledge of Hermetic philosophy and related currents. So maybe I shouldn't be so dismissive of your comment that many buildings do incorporate principles of Solomon's Temple. That is the case in churches, synagogues, Masonic lodges, medieval cathedrals, usually in terms of the dimension and elevation. In this case, it was the procession through the building was meant to be something that was lived. It wasn't just incorporating, cribbing a few notes. It was actually taking on the processional route through the building as modeled by the 3 stages of the temple.
Indeed. Very fascinating stuff. And it's also very interesting that these things always are rooted back to Egypt, but for good reason, of course. And you did mention the Sphinx on top of the building there. You have a very, very interesting building. You've got, like you said, these hieroglyphs, and you have all sorts of strange things like the numerological codes that are embedded in the building. I mean, it's just it's very fascinating. I'm blown away by it. I never even knew that this building had incorporated all these things in it. It's remarkable.
Well, here's this kind of is a decent snapshot of understanding the level of sophistication of the architect. Is that hidden on the roof of the building, on the chest of those sphinxes that maybe you have an image of, and if you don't, I'd welcome that you share it with your audience, is that it has this hieroglyphic message. And when I first spotted it and took a photograph of it on the roof, it was remarkable because it's not gibberish. It's not just borrowing familiar Egyptian themes or images, hieroglyphs like the Eye of Horus or the Ankh, the crucifix-shaped image with the circular top. It actually was grammatically accurate, and it was invoking the sun. And in the very center of it was the cartouche of Tutmosis III. So it wasn't just, just being, fluffy with it. It actually, that element of the building directly correlated to the motion of the sun inside the Great Hall. It's called the Grand Staircase Hall. So what happened after World War I is a lot of this knowledge of architecture and the way architects were trained had been lost and had given birth to the rise of what's known as international style or modernism. And these older ancient ideas of the purpose of buildings had been lost. And in many ways, this is the last of the Mohicans. But Chicago, for instance, just it just took me in. It became a 10-year investigation because it was more of an omnibus of esoteric world civilization. And I mentioned numerology, but as far as I know, this is the only building in the world where laws are enacted that literally has a 666 inside the building and a 666 that circumscribes the outside of the building. So the grand staircase hall with the two bison where the sun moves through is the interior dimensions are 66.6 feet in width and 66.6 feet in length. And that same dimension also corresponds to the length and width of the building. So it's not like the architect is just willy-nilly playing with numbers. And also the number 13 is found everywhere. The number of stairs, the number of lights, the number of stones that hold up the archway, the number of chairs around the speaker's chair, the height of what's called the golden boy, who's the figure on the dome, which is really the Greek god Hermes, is exactly from head to toe 13 feet. 13 is just everywhere. So it's a building full of 666 and 13. But the architect borrows these ideas to invert them. And that's the ingeniousness of it. It's not like it's some homage to Satan. It's actually ascribing that there is a power to numbers, an ontological power of numbers, and that if you incorporate them wisely, you could use them for effective purposes.
By the way, up on the chat room, hopefully you could hear me now, Frank.
Oh, I didn't hear you at all.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now, Frank?
So I can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. I was switching things over. Sorry about that. A little bit of a delay there. But yeah, I do have that image up in the chat room, and it's extremely fascinating that it would be incorporated in this building. But again, once you really think about it, it totally makes sense why.
Well, it didn't make sense to me. Initially, I thought that this was some biblical mumbo jumbo. And bear in mind, this architect wasn't just willy-nilly playing with numbers, as I described earlier.
Yes.
He had a command of Greek, Hebrew, and Latin. His father was a very famous theologian. And so by the time he was 15 years old, he learned how to read the Bible in its original tongue. And part of his tutelage from his father, who was a very famous theologian, author of many books, was that you could read the superficial stories of the Bible, kind of like the garments that we wear. Then there's the body of the text, which are the allegorical meanings. And then even deeper still was the soul of the Bible, which could only be understood at the letter level. And that idea firmly planted in a fertile young mind, a brilliant young mind who was an excellent draftsman, used that as to develop an architectural career that and his master work was this building in Winnipeg. And being born in Winnipeg, and many people from that have visited, is probably one of the most iconic buildings in Canada in terms of legislative buildings. And and there it was this whole time in my own backyard, and I hadn't noticed that it was a Masonic reconstruction of Solomon's Temple and the masterwork of a British occultist.
It's a beautiful building, no doubt about it. And of course, I did want to ask you a little bit about your background. I didn't ask this question here. I should have when we first started the Oh no. I do apologize, folks, and I think my audio should be coming back now.
Yep, there you
are. Yes, we've been having a strange time here doing the live program, and yes, Be Silly in the chat room is wondering what it is. I wonder what it is as well. But now it seems like the audio is working again, so here we go. Frank, I'm not sure, well, obviously you didn't exactly catch what I was saying, but it's just very unusual, the long history that Freemasonry has. It's very unique in Canada, per se. And I was actually asking you about your upbringing, which I should have perhaps asked you when we were beginning this interview, but I was very curious if you had a religious upbringing, Frank.
No, not really. I mean, I grew up with Roman Catholic parents, but it was not instilled, not doctrinal, not dogmatic in the slightest, just, you know, a cultural trimming.
Okay, I see. Understood. And again, Frank, are you a Freemason yourself?
Well, I'm glad you got that cat out of the bag. I became a Freemason in the quest of trying to get into the mind of this architect, namely because at the time I realized that the scholarship of Freemasonry had been divided into two camps. One is the denounced naysayers that think Freemasonry is in league with the devil, and then those who are Freemasons who proclaim to be the progenitors of Enlightenment. The same way that a cultural anthropologist will do an ethnography, and that is you actually say, if you're instance interested in the Guayani Indians of South America, you actually travel to South America, you learn their language, you eat their food, you spend some time with them, you perhaps may even get initiated into their rites, and then you remove yourself out of that society to write about it in a dispassionate way. And I thought that the scholarship of Freemasonry had been entirely polarized. It's either highly sensational or complete nonsense. And there were particular elements within this building that inspired me to actually go through the ritual grades, because what's unique about Freemasonry is that it's an entire builder's tradition. The whole of Freemasonry revolves around architecture. And that was, in fact, the subject of my dissertation, where I wrote on the architecture of Freemasonry. And most people that will write about Freemasonry will gloss over that very key ingredient. So as the architect who I was trying to understand was a Freemason, I thought, what actually do they do? So I became initiated into the 3 grades. And it was actually during my entered apprentice degree, which is the first degree, that I realized I had a eureka moment where I realized that the degree is actually veiled in one of the most famous murals in the building, perhaps one of the most famous in Canada, which is a World War I scene, which on the surface looks like Canada's efforts allegorized in the First World War. And then yet at another level, it depicts the Passion of Christ. And yet at another level, it also reveals rather plainly, and it becomes so patently obvious once you go through the ritual grade, that it is a veiled depiction of the entered apprentice degree. So for me at the time, I thought, oh, well, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to write an ethnography on Freemasonry. I'm going to actually go inside, see what they do, and give public tours of the building where I describe those things in great detail. I wouldn't call myself a Freemason today, namely because you have to pay your dues every year. I've only gone through the degrees, the 3 degrees. I'm not highly advanced, and purely to understand the building from an ethnographic perspective.
it went it went dead all of a sudden yet again. But this time I think you could hear me now, right?
I can.
You can hear me. Okay, perfect. Yes, again, I do apologize for those listening live. Lots of issues here behind the scenes. I'm not sure what's going on, but we are back and things sound fine. And I was just asking you about being a Freemason because I had a lot of questions from listeners out there wondering, in fact, if you were a Freemason, and you just answered it. Of course you are.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not one, nor have I been one 18 years. And here's the amazing bit, at least for me, about talking about Freemasonry, is that most Freemasons know nothing, absolutely nothing about their degrees, the ritual get-ups that they get involved in. In fact, in the very first degree, I noticed that the way they were pronouncing Hebrew words was radically incorrect. So I was wondering what it is that they were saying. So I don't think I've been a very good Freemason in the sense that you're not supposed to speak of the signs, tokens, or passwords, and that's largely what I talk about.
That's hilarious. And I have never been approached by the Freemasons per se. The logo of my show is pretty blunt. It is designed that way as a sign of recognition that the United States is a Masonic republic. I think everyone can agree with that by now. And I have been approached by different groups for different reasons. And of course, I'm not a part of any group or affiliated to any political party, that's for sure. But it is interesting that these certain groups do exist and they do try to recruit you. I always found that kind of interesting.
Well, in my case, I expressly went out of my way to actually go through the grades. I just knocked on the Grand Secretary's office and said, okay, what actually do you do? How can I be a member of this fraternity? And it's there. He asked me 3 questions. He said, well, there are 3 prerequisites of joining Freemasonry. The first is, do you believe in God? And I said, what do you mean? Like Buddha, Krishna, Allah, and is there any discretion there? And he said, no, you have to believe in a great architect of the universe, which sounds like a flowery way of saying, you mean an intelligent designer. So I would consider myself fairly agnostic, even though several of my graduate work was in religious subjects. So I said, okay, what's the second thing? Are you freeborn, not a slave, and over the age of 21? Yes, I'm freeborn, not a slave, and over the age of 21. What's the third thing? Do you have an ardent striving for truth? And those remain in pretty much most lodges around the world. The 3 essential prerequisites for joining Masonic Lodge. You don't need to be tapped. You don't need to have someone ask you to join. It's of your own free will and volition, as long as you are based on, but those are the 3 fundamental prerequisites.
Understood. And of course, I'm curious, what was the most fascinating thing you learned while diving deep into these matters, Frank?
Well, it was nothing to be found in the lodge per se. Those things are rather stolid and banal. But do you mean in the course of my studies?
Sure. Yeah.
I think the lack of recognition for, at least as a cultural provider, of Hermes Trismegistus.
Oh, very interesting.
I would call him the Bigfoot of Western civilization. That is somebody who we kind of have tangentially recognized as no, maybe that's not that's not a good analogy. But yeah, Hermes, the figure of Hermes, and I don't mean the swift-footed messenger of the gods as noted in classical myth.
Right.
But Hermes Trismegistus, who is the author of a vast collection of esoteric writings that ignited the mind of Renaissance intellectuals and very much became the basis of the preconditions of the development of modern science. The very notion that within our mind, the intellect has the capacity to read the book of nature. And there's this fantastic illustration in Copernicus's Revolutions, where for the very first time he provides the criteria that shows us scientifically that we live in a heliocentric system. And there, on the very same page that you see the great model that we're all familiar with, the birth of modern science is right there, that moment, that page. He ascribes his knowledge to proposing that the sun is at the center because Hermes said so in the Corpus Hermeticum. So in that sense, that's what I was alluding to as Hermes being somewhat of a quasi-Bigfoot, extremely important, vibrant component of Western intellectual thought, but not within the realm of Greek rational philosophy and not within the realm of biblical faith, but the middle pillar, the middle path, the esoteric underground stream of knowledge that can all be safely within the wheelhouse of Hermetic knowledge. And I knew nothing about Hermes other than his figure was on the dome of this building. So of, I think, all the things that I've studied, I think it's the body of wisdom and philosophy that comes from Hermetic writings that certainly motivated me.
Amazing stuff. And of course, you mentioned earlier on that you take tours out there. And I was just very curious if there's been any disasters, anything that's unusual, anyone that's acted a little strange during one of these tours. I'm always up for a good bad story.
No, although I did have the opportunity to tour the future King of England, the Prince of Wales, and we had a great discussion. He's actually a bright guy, about it's an ancient measurement called the cubit, which is derived from the distance of your elbow to the tip of your finger, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that everyone has a different cubit.
Right.
But in the ancient world, that you're probably familiar with that very famous image from the Renaissance. It's the image of the Renaissance, which is called the Vitruvian Man, from the illustration by Da Vinci of the naked man inside of the circle and the square. And that was meant to illustrate for architects. It actually comes from a book of architecture written about 2,000 years ago by Vitruvius. And inside, what it illustrates is that there's a harmony, a mathematical, geometrical harmony to the body. And this harmony is related to something called the golden section. And so we were discussing the cubit, which is the unit of measurement used in building Solomon's temple, but it's also the unit of measurement used in building the Parthenon, building the Great Pyramid. There is a standardized cubit, and once you know what that is, you basically have access to the architect's mind, because once you have a standard unit of measurement in the ancient world derived from the human body, then you can have an understanding of what dimensions the architect is taking in their design. So we had this great chat for about 30 minutes on the cubit inside a room that is directly parallels the Holy of Holies of King Solomon's temple. So it was that was a really neat moment.
Yeah, that's a pretty fantastic sort of experience to have, especially showing someone like him around. I'm sure he was blown away as well.
Oh yeah, he was.
Oh yeah. It's a beautiful building, by the way, for those that have never actually looked it up online or been there in person. It's a stunning structure. And of course, I wanted you to tell us about your book, Astana. And as I read up on Astana, it is no longer the name for the capital of Kazakhstan. And the name change came due to the resignation of the president. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Okay, well, yeah. Do you mean you want me to tell you about the book?
Sure, both. About the name change and the book.
Well, the book is many things. At one level, it is the first comprehensive study of the architecture of Astana, now called Nur-Sultan. Before that, it was, it's been many names, by the way, but it was built from scratch. It's a blueprint utopia, and you could just do a quick Google search, and you'll find that it has the most exotic, alien, out-of-this-world architecture ever seen. And because of that, it's been widely described as the Illuminati capital of the world. And I was preparing at the time a graduate course on utopian cities and foundation myths for graduate students. And I'd stumbled upon Astana. That's what it was called at the time.
Astana.
Say again?
Oh, I was just saying Astana.
Astana, yeah.
Yeah.
So they, why I took such an interest in it is that I could see how superficially you can make you can potentially identify that it has Illuminati themes.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Right. But to me, I wanted to write a book about it that would look at that and sort of turn it on its head. And so what I did was I wrote it in the form of a foundation myth, meaning that at one level, you're going to get a comprehensive history of Central Asia and a in-depth study of the buildings and symbolism of the capital city of Kazakhstan. Totally bizarre. It looks like Las Vegas on some occult steroids.
It's the greatest thing I've ever seen, and I had no idea it even existed. I only heard of it briefly a couple times, and I'll get into that in a moment here, but I just wanted to quickly add that the structures are the most beautiful structures I've ever seen in my entire life. I'm blown away by it.
Oh yeah, like, I mean, on the surface, you'll see these completely otherworldly buildings. The world's largest outdoor tent, which is called the Khan Shatar Mall. It's a massive, huge mall in the shape of the tent called the yurt in Kazakhstan, Central Asian nomadic culture. There's a giant UFO. Yes, they built a UFO that you can walk into in the shape of a perfect saucer disc. There's a massive glass pyramid. There is called the Palace of Peace and Reconciliation, where every 3 years, world religious leaders around the world meet at the apex of a giant glass pyramid in the center of Central Asia in Kazakhstan to discuss world religion and the harmony of nations. I'm not making this up. This happens every 3 years at the apex, the pinnacle of a glass pyramid. And there's a bunch of other things. There's a library in the shape of an all-seeing eye. So on the surface, you say triangles, pyramids, pentagrams, all-seeing eyes. What the hell are they doing over there? So
incredible, yeah.
I saw this as a very superficial reading, and instead, the buildings were plot devices. They were devices of Kazakhstan trying to narrate to the world that it is the new Geneva. And so what I did was I coded the book, kind of like the Voynich manuscript, where I placed a puzzle. There's a series of cryptograms and enigmas and anomalies within the book that are designed to beckon the reader to read closely the text, read between the lines, and if you discover the hidden riddle that I placed within the book, then I will reward you a remarkable prize, which consists of $5,000 US, 2 first-class tickets to travel to the most remarkable capital city ever built or conceived. And on my dime, I will put you up in the most remarkable 5-star hotel for 7 nights. So
yes.
at one level, it's a remarkable study of this outrageous capital city. And at another level, it is a study of the power of myth and symbolism. And yet at another level, it's a treasure hunt.
Yes, and I was just going to mention here that on your, I know we're jumping a little bit ahead here, but on your website, I did see that challenge, and I wanted you to sort of tell me more about it, but you just did. And it says, solve the puzzle of the hidden message in the Astana architecture, myth, and destiny, and of course, win a luxury vacation to the Illuminati capital in the world. And of course, I take it no one has yet solved the riddle yet, correct?
That is correct.
Wow.
I mean, you cheeky bugger, what are you trying to do? And with this puzzle. And I will let your listeners in on a little hint. And that is the inspiration for the puzzle comes from two unexpected sources. Well, three. The first is the Rosicrucians. Are you familiar with them?
Correct. Yes, the Rosicrucians.
Yeah. So the Rosicrucians were the progenitor to Freemasonry. And in the 17th century, as a response to the crisis of faith and the 30 Years' War that ravaged Europe, they cloaked a reformation of the world in a symbolic mystery that was meant to be solved by readers and people that wanted to join the Rosicrucian Brotherhood. Now, it was completely invented. There was no Rosicrucian Brotherhood. It was invented by a bunch of Protestant intellectuals in Tübingen, and they wrote these works in such a, like, kind of in a way of placing the pebble of a mystery in a great pond and dropping that mystery in the pond and seeing the ripples of it. And what had occurred unexpectedly is people wanted to join the order because the order promised to bring together science, religion, faith, and theology, and that it was offering this solution to epistemological problems in the 17th century. And strangely enough, it was the greatest publicity stunt of all time, because we're still talking about them as if the Rosicrucians actually existed, and they didn't. And then the second inspiration was the Oxford Inklings that looked at elements of the 20th century. The Oxford Inklings were largely. Had you heard of the Oxford Inklings?
I believe so.
Okay, so they were probably the least known but most important literary circle that most people don't know about, because it was comprised of J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and we know their works. But what you might not know is that they wrote the foundation works of Western children fantasy literature, like The Lord of the Rings and The Chronicles of Narnia, as cover stories. So what I mean by that is when you're reading Lord of the Rings, you have no idea that you're being inculcated into Roman Catholic theology. That is the intention behind the works.
Yes.
And the same thing with C.S. Lewis. The whole of the 7 books of the Chronicles of Narnia are actually based on the medieval planets or the planets of medieval cosmology. And the ingeniousness of their work is that they knew that the great threats of the 20th century were disenchantment, enemy, and the destruction of moral norms. So the only way that they can correct those was to write fantasy, write mythic literature for children to give them an alternative to disenchantment. So in other words, to enchant children. But even that, as I use in the example of the Bible, is just the superficial reading of the work. Behind that, it has this effort of being a social good. So combining the symbolic elements of the Rosicrucians and this the mythic themes from the Oxford Inklings, I thought, is there a way of doing a similar thing in the 21st century? So in the book, I argue that there are three great threats that we face in the 21st century. Tolkien and Lewis identified three great threats in the 20th century. I looked at the 21st century and said, what are the three great threats? And you might not agree with them. These are mine. Other people could say that I think that's ridiculous, but I think it's the proliferation of nuclear weapons. It's the future sustainability of the planet, and it is religious extremism and intolerance.
No, I agree with you on that one.
Okay, so those are the three elements that I'm trying to bring a panacea for.
Understood.
That's the real purpose of the book. So veiled within the pages of it are enigmas and secrets. You're going to learn all about the very interesting architecture there. But deeper still, I provide what I think is a solution to these three great threats of the 21st century.
Understood. And those are some good choices, in my opinion, that definitely seem to be the cause of all sorts of issues that we currently face. I think those are quite worthy of being chosen, Frank. And of course, now in the chat room, I do have the image of the Badarek Tower, which represents the Tree of Life, and the Golden Spear, an egg.
The sun.
Or the sun, rather. It's incredible. Again, these structures, I'm blown away by them. And I would just love an opportunity to go out there simply because of these incredible buildings. And I'm curious, what is the nightlife like out there?
It's amazing. I
Really?
mean, I knew nothing about it myself. I stumbled upon it doing a quick Google search preparing for this graduate course. And then I found myself very quickly descending down this rabbit hole of conspiracy and some wacko ideas, by the way, about Astana. So it intrigued me from the start. So I traveled there about 8 times in the process of researching for this book. And just before it went to print, I told my publisher I had this eureka moment, which I did. And I said, you have to stop publication. And she's like, it's literally on the presses, ready to be printed. And we can't stop it. And I said, we have to stop it because I need to take it back and recode it to put in this treasure hunt. And so that during that time, I spent some time in Astana because I wanted to take from the elements that you see at night in the capital city, and so it's funny you should mention it because that was part of my inspiration.
Beautiful. Yes.
Let me code the book. And she thought it was crazy. She said, no, we're not going to do that. And as a little sidebar to it, the prize is actually out of pocket by me. I get.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It's not like I have some beneficiary. This is like literally an out-of-pocket expense for me, which is not nearly as much as I would, is way more than I would ever get paid for writing the book. So, not to try to say I'm being completely altruistic with it, but it was, she just didn't want to publish. She was like, no, we're not doing that. That's crazy. It's already a great work. Let's just get it out there. And I said, no. I knew why I'd written the book. And to me, I felt that just in the same way, and here's the third inspiration actually, is I was working on a new book, which was on Satoshi Nakamoto, who's the purported founder of Bitcoin. And
that's right.
I was intrigued by the idea of placing a proof of work riddle inside. So there should be some reward with it. And scour the book, take it apart, read it, decipher it, attack it. and it's it's a really fun piece of scholarship.
It really is. And now I do have an image of the pyramid known as the Palace of Peace and Reconciliation, or Accord. I've heard some people say that. And it's a nighttime image of the pyramid, and you see fireworks in the background. And my God, it's stunning.
Isn't it wild? Like, you're like, what? Is this the homeland of Borat?
I can't even believe it exists.
It is. That is exactly how it is. That's the freaky part. When you're there, you realize that this massive, epic, $60 billion fantasy project exists.
Yeah, it's just blowing me away when I was looking at images. And of course, you mentioned Borat. And to be honest with you, most Americans, when the first time they were ever exposed to Kazakhstan was because of the movie Borat. And that's just the way that's America for you. But the thing is, Kazakhstan, I've actually have heard of it maybe a year or two way before the movie even released. So when I did see the movie, I was just thinking, well, that doesn't make sense. But actually, I do like the movie Borat, and I do like Sacha Baron Cohen. I think he's an amazing talent. He's a good comedian. When that movie came out, what was your perception of that?
Well, I mean, the movie came out well before I
right
was writing this work. But what was called, in fact, the scenes that were apparently showcased in Kazakhstan was a Romanian gypsy village, by the way.
Sure.
And the shocking thing about actually being in Kazakhstan is that it's a country of extraordinary splendor. Not only that, but in fact, I opened the book by showing 3 great discoveries that happened in Kazakhstan over the last 15 years. One is they did unearth massive pyramids, step pyramids from around 1200 BCE. You would never, ever in a million years associate pyramid building with Central Asia, which is largely a nomadic culture. But voila, there they are. And it's not a hoax. There were pyramids constructed in Kazakhstan. The other thing was the discovery of massive, they're called geoglyphs, massive, kind of think of the Nazca Line in Peru.
Oh, yeah.
Except these geoglyphs were unknown and only recently discovered. And among the remarkable symbolism that was inscribed on the earth is one of the earliest swastikas. Thirdly is the world's largest pentagram is carved on the side of a desolate lake in Kazakhstan. And Google Earth, you'd be able to search it by typing in, maybe you could still do it now, by just typing in into Google right now, Devil's Pentagram. And you type that into Google Earth, and it would zone right into this area. And lo and behold, there is a giant, massive pentagram. So I opened the book by saying, you think you know Kazakhstan via Borat, but did you know pyramids, pentagram, and swastika are found on the earth there? So I hope I have your attention, and that was used as a bit of eye candy to get people in the door to read even much more about the remarkable history of the culture. In many ways, Kazakhstan is the forerunner to what is the birth of what we call civilization. Civilization happened, according to ancient academic inquiry, as being either the Fertile Crescent, that is Mesopotamia, Sumer,
wow,
or Egypt.
I have that image up, by the way, in the chat room now. It's a giant pentagram from Google Earth.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
I'm stunned.
You could look up the swastika as well. And the pyramid, I mean, this is all, I'm not giving you any nonsense.
Right.
And yeah, so this was my way of saying, here is an ancient culture completely different than the characterization in Borat, with this hyper modern, extraordinary city. And as a historian of architecture, nothing has ever been conceived of at this scale. There were 20 years ago, there was nothing in what is now the modern capital city of Kazakhstan. So think of absolutely nothing, a tabula rasa, barren earth, and then in a period of 20 years building a capital city that is only meant to grow to 3 million people.
Out of nowhere. Yeah, out of nowhere, these great monuments come out.
It was designed from the outset with a master plan. So most cities today accrete, they grow over time, they get urban sprawl, they become ugly. And not so in this capital city. It was designed with a fundamental blueprint that is only meant to have the city grow to 3 million. And once there's 3 million, that's it. No more construction. They'll move to building another capital.
I want to live there. I'm not going to lie to you.
Except it's
amazing.
It's just all hell.
That is incredible. The whole, every structure there is just amazing. It easily tops anything we've got out here in America. Our buildings suck. To be perfectly honest with you, the modern buildings here in America today are kind of lacking when you compare them to other locations around the world. Great structures all over the world, except in America, we only have so few. It's a very unusual thing.
Yeah.
Especially, I have to say, hands down, I think my favorite looking building comes from Dubai. I believe that would go to a little unknown name, but I'm sure you probably are familiar with him. David Fisher, who came up with the dynamic tower, or the Da Vinci Tower, as they say. Now that is an amazing building that actually rotates, ladies and gentlemen. That is insane.
Yeah, no, Dubai is certainly out of this world.
Pretty badass.
Divorced from the culture. In the case of Kazakhstan, the elements and themes and symbolism of the capital all derive from one of the oldest religious movements and the fundamental element of Kazakh culture, which is Nobanism and Tengrianism. So it's different. Dubai to me seems like a modern version of Brasilia, which to me lacks any kind of real sensible human qualities.
I'm with you on that. I do still prefer Kazakhstan, however, and I'm looking at an image right now. I have it up in the chat room. It's the Central Concert Hall, which is another futuristic venue. And again, I really had no clue this thing even existed. And this building looks like another Ufo.
Uses bioclimatic architecture, and from above is in the shape of a vesica piscis. Oops. There.
Oh, did we get cut off? Can you hear that? I'm sorry about that. Oh, now, can you hear me okay now?
Yep.
Okay, yeah. Too bad we keep getting cut off here. I think the chat room can hear me though. And what about now? Can you hear me? Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's very crackly.
Wow. Amazing stuff here tonight. I'm not quite sure why we keep having this sort of game of tag. And you might have lost me again, folks.
coming faintly.
What about now?
No.
I might have lost him, folks. He is not hearing me. Definitely not a good thing, because we could hear him loud and clear. Hearing me for whatever purpose he's doing. Oh, no. Boys and girls, taking another hit here, it seems. The audio is just not working out for whatever reason. Skype has failed us yet again. I don't know why, but let's see if we could probably call him back here, and perhaps he could hear us. Let's try something new, boys and girls. And again, I do thank all of you out there for your patience. Let me see if I could get him back on the line yet again here. I'm giving him a little call. Don't worry. Eventually, he will return. Giving his account a little buzz here, folks. Let's see what happens. And I think we might have fixed the error here.
Okay.
Yes. Can you hear me now, Frank?
Yep.
All right, perfect. I'm glad to have you back on. I was just mentioning the trouble we've been having here, and it's been outrageous. And I was mentioning this concert hall building, and I was asking if you've actually been inside of it for any kind of concert yourself.
Yes.
Oh, you have?
Yep. My favorite building in Astana is called the Nazarbayev Library, or the Presidential Library. Maybe you want to bring that up. And the Golden Sphere, which is the was the central pavilion of the World Expo. If you want to really blow away your listeners, show the closing ceremonies of the Astana World Expo, which happened in 2017, and see that will definitely raise some eyebrows.
The Astana World Expo, you said?
The World Expo was in Astana in 2017, and it was dedicated to the future sustainability of the planet. So they built an entire expo. The entire expo grounds were based on harnessing the 5 elements, earth, air, water, fire, and ether, and in a systematic way that could show how the planet could run sustainably. And the central pavilion of the expo is the world's largest glass sphere, which emits these extraordinary lights and is remarkably based on H.N. Louis Boulet, a 18th century Freemason's vision of the cenotaph of Isaac Newton. But they take that, think of the expo. You just have to see it. It's out of this world.
I got it now up on the chat room, and yeah, I'm looking at it now, and incredible. Looking at the giant spear. My goodness. Incredible stuff, really, folks. And I think he's typing to me here. Not quite sure if Frank hears me or not.
Oh, I gotcha.
You got me back. Okay, perfect. Yes, I do have the image up now on the chat room. Oh, no.
Cool.
Yes. My goodness. And again, ladies and gentlemen, another place to visit in the world, if you do have the financial means to go and visit Kazakhstan, definitely a place to go vacation at. Wow. Incredible stuff. And Frank, did I lose you again?
Every now and then, but the last 2 words I caught you.
Okay, perfect. Yes, I was just mentioning the astonishing looking building here, and I do have the Expo 2017 Future Energy picture up here.
Yeah, isn't it out of this world?
It is. Again, I didn't even know this existed.
That's,
Good Lord.
That's one of the great myths I wanted to expose about Kazakhstan and Astana. It's the most remarkable place you'd never heard of.
Yeah, someone in the chat room, Be Silly, they say it's creepy. And I agree. It's so creepy that the buildings are very futuristic. It's astonishing. I certainly wish I knew about this a lot sooner. It seems like a place that I would definitely want to visit.
Yep, it's definitely bucket list worthy.
My goodness. And of course, I was looking at your bio and it says that you've also were an advisor for a major film. Which film was that, by the way, Frank?
Well, I worked with a number of production companies. I since have a project with History Channel right now. So when often in terms of historical, when you need a historical consultant. So there were projects I did for A&E, one for Netflix, one for History. And I'm working on one now called Cracking the Code. I probably should have sent you the sizzle reel for, which is, anyways, it's an interesting show about showing hidden patterns in everything from crystals to the sound of music.
Amazing. And which History Channel program did you work on?
There was several of them.
Okay.
But let me remember now. One that comes to mind is it was picked up by Vision. I think it was called Heretics or Rat.
Okay.
It was on basically heresy and heretics.
Oh, okay.
It was it was about 15 years ago. I think I forgot by now.
Oh, wow. And it wasn't anything, well, nothing you've done yet. You haven't done anything as of late in TV, correct? Or anything recent?
No, I mean, just this this current project we have in pilot called Cracking the Code on, I think right now it's with History. Whether it gets it gets produced is another matter.
Understood. And
yeah, in the film and television industry, as you might know, is you work on either work with production companies or broadcasters like History, A&E, Vision, whoever they are, National Geographic, and sometimes those shows get made, sometimes they don't. But what was the I wish I could remember. Became very popular. I think it was called Decoded. I can't remember.
Understood. And in terms of, well, maybe I should backtrack and say that I talk a lot about everything basically under the sun, from conspiracies to UFOs and extraterrestrials and the paranormal, all sorts of fantastic and romantic ideas, no doubt. I was curious if you believed in extraterrestrials yourself.
Well, it's funny you should mention that because I'm doing I'm organizing an event for Atlas Obscura. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Perhaps your audience would be. They're the National Geographic of the world's most wondrous places. So they're a website that has great articles, great content on what you would probably call dark tourism. So out of the way places that you might not, for instance, if you go to Paris, you go see the Eiffel Tower. You go to Sydney, you see the Opera House. If you take the Atlas Obscura version of going to those cities, you would see things that wouldn't necessarily be, the standard must-see sites. So I partnered with them on doing something in Manitoba called, I think, Mysteries of Winnipeg. And part of it is we are going to the exact site of the purported landing of a UFO in 1968 in Manitoba, which is one of the best documented UFO sites. Best documented as in the person that saw the UFO had actually been burned by the UFO with photographic evidence and many other interesting things. And I'm taking with me on this part of the journey. It's a 5-day event. You come to Winnipeg. We go to the itinerary is out of this world, but you get an insider's view, a curated insider's view on many things. But on the UFO side, Chris Vertowski is going to lead that part of it on horseback. We're going to travel on horseback to this UFO landing site, and he is the definitive guide for as a real UFO researcher. I'd maybe even suggest that you have him on your show. So,
sure.
Yeah, we're going to get the other things we're doing is an insider's glimpse at state-of-the-art Bitcoin mine. We're going to spend our evenings in a historically haunted hotel. Of course, go to the Manitoba Legislative Building, visit an ancient petroform site. The largest, oldest rock settlement site in North America happens to be about an hour and a half from Winnipeg. We're going to participate in an ancient healing ceremony of the Anishinaabe people, and then have an opportunity to go to an ayahuasca retreat center.
Oh, wow.
And then, of course, conclude with the UFO and Bigfoot hunting.
Wow, that's a lot going on out there.
Yeah, you know what? I'll find a way of sending you the link in our Skype chat here, and you can take a look at it.
Sure, no doubt. And that brings me to my next question. So you are definitely in terms of the paranormal. Have you ever had an experience yourself?
I abhor the term. I don't. No, I don't. Even though it's a my subject matter is esotericism.
Sure.
I'm interested in the history of it as opposed to being an actual practitioner of any aspect of it, including the paranormal. So this isn't me poo-pahing it in
Sure.
any way.
It's okay.
But it turns out that this city, in addition to having this remarkable temple that masquerading as a house of government, it's also widely known as the the center of a lot of paranormal activity. Which, when I was in graduate school, I won the T.G. Hamilton Award, which is an award that you can get from the University of Manitoba, which is the collection of works of a medical doctor at the turn of the 20th century who has the largest collection of ectoplasmic research and seance research. A colleague of mine, Professor Serena Khashabji, is writing a book about him. And he was widely known around the world for his activity here, which even drew the attention of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes, who traveled to Winnipeg to do seances with Dr. T.G. Hamilton. He left, having written a 3-volume work on the history of spiritualism. Most people didn't know that Doyle was that much into spiritualism, but he was. But he left Winnipeg and said of all the places that he'd ever been, and he was a great world traveler, Winnipeg is the most psychically active place that he'd ever visited. It's been part of a bit of our own dark tourism, is certainly the supernatural. So I decided to kind of curate this tour where I myself am going to be learning about things that I didn't even know about the city.
Wow. Hey, you're a pretty fascinating guy, Frank.
Well, you thank you. It's good to be open-minded.
It definitely is. And Frank, I do want to thank you tremendously for being a part of the program. I don't want to take up too much of your time here.
That's perfect. I'm glad we're signing off now. It's late for me here.
Yes, it's super late where you're at. And I definitely took that for consideration. I know it's very late where you're at. So I definitely want to wrap up here tonight. And I see the link that you sent me. I'll definitely look it up and look into that. Definitely interesting, and I do want to thank you again for being a part of the program. You are a fascinating individual, and I certainly hope someone cracks the case. And
I hope so too.
Yeah.
The puzzle is meant to be deciphered, and once you find out what it is, it'll put everything that I've done, I think, over the last 20 years into proper context. It's a really interesting work.
Yes, definitely. I hope someone cracks the case and is able to go out there and visit the site and see the sounds and interact with the people and enjoy the nightlife. I would definitely like to go out there myself. And again, Frank, I do want to thank you for being a part of the program. And of course, if you'd like to plug anything, here is a great chance to do so. The floor is yours, Frank. Go ahead.
No, I'm happy to chat, and I hope your viewers found it interesting.
Oh yes, I think a lot of the listeners out there were blown away by it. I'm sure none of them have even really looked into Kazakhstan and the wonders that brings, the wonders it brings, really, the joy it brings to people out there the first time they actually look and see these great structures themselves, and including Canada as well.
You got it.
Yes, sir.
Let's do it again sometime.
All right, my friend. We'll definitely do it again on the other side, and I hope you have a good rest out there.
Okay, you as well.
All right,
Take
Frank.
care.
Take care. Good night.
Bye-bye.
And there he goes, ladies and gentlemen. That was Frank Albo. Great guest. Definitely liked hearing about that and reading about Kazakhstan. And, of course, reading up on Canada. I had a great time tonight on the program, and of course researching these guests. Both James Perloff and Frank Albo, they definitely delivered here tonight. And before I wrap up, I definitely wanted to give everyone a heads up. I definitely do plan to start releasing shows on the Patreon. That's patreon.com/michaeldeacon.com. And of course, those programs might not be live, because we've been having all sorts of issues during the live show here. But hopefully, all of that will be cleared away in due time. So I might just do a few pre-recorded episodes before I actually start doing those shows live. And of course, I will be bringing back the TuneIn radio channel. For those out there who have been wondering, and those that love TuneIn, yeah, you'll be able to hear the live show yet again. The Patreon episodes, however, will be exclusive. You'll have to pay a few dollars for those. However, every show that goes down on Saturday will remain free. I'm not going to take that away from you. Trust me. And, one of the real reasons why I'm actually starting the whole Patreon thing is to get new equipment here. The microphone seems to be working now, but been having some trouble with that and trouble with this mixer here. Lots of technical glitches here and there. So that's why I would have to try to hold off from doing those shows live. I definitely don't want to deliver a subpar sort of episode like tonight. Great guests, however, lots of technical issues. And that's going to happen. You have to expect that every now and then here when you're doing a live show. But I do appreciate all of you out there who tuned in tonight and stuck around through all the drama. There was plenty of drama here tonight. And of course, we still got through. The show must go on. And I do want to give my appreciation to all the international listeners out there and those in the chat room. Definitely appreciate you, and those in the UK and Canada, Australia, and France. The Netherlands also out there. Appreciate you folks greatly. And of course, those that will be listening on a Sunday night over at the Fringe FM. Much love and respect for all of you out there. And of course, my home state of California. Love all of you out there tremendously. I can't even believe it. You Californians out there listening to this program, it warms my heart. It really does. And of course, those in Austin, Flint, and Richardson, that's out there in Texas. Lots of listeners out there. And of course, keep in mind, boys and girls, if you truly are a listener and love the show, please continue to spread the word. Let people know we're out here. You can catch the podcast rendition of this program on iTunes, Stitcher, and of course, what I love, CastBox. Great platform there. I return again very soon, boys and girls. Thanks for being here. I'm Michael Deacon, and with that said, the world is a mysterious place, and life itself is a mystery. Until next time, good night, everybody.